Königsberg tucked itself into the maps of Europe, a quiet Prussian town perched by the Prigel River, a place where bridges stitched the island city together and where scholars spoke in careful, measured tones about the nature of knowledge, of matter, of the mind. It's tempting to imagine Immanuel Kant as a figure of routine, a librarian's calm in a world of gusts and debates, and in a very real sense, that image captures a part of him. He was born in 1724 into a family of modest means, in a city that would, for him, become both cradle and proving ground for ideas that would reverberate through modern philosophy. His father, a harness maker, died when Kant was still young, leaving behind a household that valued frugality, piety, and a discipline of work. His mother, a woman of remarkable steadfastness, instilled in him a sense of duty and a habit of turning inward to reflect, to question, and to persevere. Kant's education began within the walls of Königsberg schools, where the ear for pithy Latin maxims and the eye for rigorous argument were cultivated side by side. He would later describe his intellectual formation as a slow, almost genteel awakening to the problem that would define his career, the problem of metaphysical speculation without solid ground, the problem of how to preserve the power and progress of science while recognizing the limits and conditions of human knowledge. In his own day, Europe was alive with the tensions of the age. The rationalist aspirations of Descartes and Leibniz, who sought to endow reason with a secure or even inspired certainty, and the empiricist temper of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, who insisted that all knowledge begins in experience and that ideas must be chained to observations. The air was thick with debates about how mind and world relate, about what we can know, and about what we must leave as a mystery beyond any possible proof. Kant would live within that pressure, and he would step into it with a move that looked small in the moment but would prove to be seismic in the long run. If we zoom in on the central problem Kant faced, we encounter a stubborn paradox. Metaphysical speculation, questions about the nature of space and time, causality, substance, freedom, God, and the soul, had a long and venerable pedigree. It was the domain of grand systems that claimed to lay the foundations of reality. Yet by the early modern era, a certain empirical skepticism had grown. The knowledge that science could offer was powerful and predictive, but its supposed foundations often rested on claims about things beyond sense, things we cannot verify with experience. The problem intensifies when you notice that metaphysics often pushes beyond the boundaries of possible experience. If reason desires to know the ultimate causes of things as they are in themselves, one can easily slip into ungrounded surmises or into barren arguments that seem to float in air without a tether to the world as we can know it. Kant saw that the metaphysical enterprise, if pursued in the old ways, often ended in empty dogmatism or in skeptical aporia that promised nothing, and in the same breath, it threatened to dissolve the very ground on which science stands, since science in its best moments presumes certain conditions of experience make sense of nature. So the central problem becomes not merely a historical curiosity, but a living concern. How can knowledge be possible at all in the realm of metaphysical questions? How can one preserve the unity and reliability of mathematics, natural science, and the moral life while acknowledging that the mind might play a role in shaping or organizing what we can know? Kant's instinct, born in Königsberg's quiet streets and sharpened by the intellectual storms of the Enlightenment, was to challenge a certain complacency, not to surrender to skepticism, but to ask whether the traditional pictures of the mind as a passive receptor and of objects as raw, unstructured things could actually fit the data of experience. This is where Kant's famous Copernican turn enters the stage. The quick, dramatic generalization is often stated in a brisk line: the mind does not merely conform to objects. Rather, objects become intelligible because of the mind's own structures. In other words, the forms of space and time and the categories of the understanding, causality, substance, unity, plurality, necessity, do not merely exist alongside experience as tools to be used magically on anything that happens to appear. They are constitutive of the way experience is possible at all. The world does not give itself to us in a raw, unmediated way. The world as we know it is filtered, organized, and given a particular shape by the mind's own architecture. To put it bluntly, Kant reframes the problem of metaphysics. Instead of trying to pry the mind away from its furniture and force it to see the world as it is in itself, he invites us to study the mind's furniture itself, to ask what it is that makes experience possible, what structures the mind must bring to hear, see, touch, and reason, and which aspects of reality remain forever beyond our reach. This is not a retreat into illusion, but a new way to guarantee that knowledge has both vigor and boundary. It is a move from an epistemology of representation to a rigorous analysis of the conditions of experience. And it is in this turn that Kant hopes to salvage science, if only by showing how science rests on necessary features of human cognition, features that are wired into the mind and inseparable from even the most careful observational practice. Let us take a moment to name a few terms that will recur, and that will anchor our exploration through Kant's career and into the critique of pure reason. First, phenomena versus noumena. Phenomena are the objects as they appear to us, the world as it is filtered through our sensory modalities and organized by our concepts. Noumena are the things in themselves, the things as they are independent of our human ways of knowing them. Kant will insist that our knowledge extends only to phenomena. The noumenal realm can be spoken of only with great caution, typically through practical postulates rather than theoretical knowledge. Then there is a priori versus a posteriori. A priori knowledge is that which can be grasped without recourse to particular experiences. Think of mathematical truths, the form of pure reason, the certainty we feel in the proposition that every effect has a cause, or that space and time are the forms through which we experience the world. A posteriori knowledge, by contrast, depends on experience, on the observation of particular things. Analytic versus synthetic judgments are next. Analytic judgments are those in which the predicate concept is contained within the subject concept. Think of all bachelors are unmarried men. Synthetic judgments, by contrast, add something to the concept that was not contained in the subject. Think of the apple is red. Kant will insist that much of mathematics and much of natural science are synthetic a priori. Judgments that extend our knowledge and yet do so not on the basis of mere analysis, but on the basis of the mind's necessary structuring of experience. From another angle, we have transcendental idealism. This is the core of Kant's position. The mind contributes to the appearance of objects in a way that makes experience possible, but that contribution does not imply that all we know is merely a mental construction. Rather, it implies that there is a real world that presents itself to us in specific, law-governed forms. The transcendental refers to the conditions that precede experience, conditions of the possibility of experience, rather than to the content of experience itself. This is where the turn aims to preserve two things at once: scientific knowledge about the regularities of nature and the possibility of moral philosophy, grounded in a sense of duty, autonomy, and rational agency. Within this framework, Kant situates himself amid two great philosophical genealogies. On one side stand the rationalists, Descartes, Leibniz, the Wolffians, who sought certain knowledge through reason's own light, often appealing to innate concepts or ideas. On the other side stand the empiricists, especially the British tradition of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, who insisted that all knowledge begins in sensory experience and that we must be cautious about the claims we can legitimately make beyond the data of experience. Hume, in particular, becomes something of a catalyst for Kant's turn. Hume's skepticism about causation and induction, his insistence that our ideas of necessary connection are not derived from the observed order of the world but from habit or custom, pushed Kant to ask, if the mind supplies the very form in which we experience things, how can science offer universal law-like knowledge about an objective world? How can we account for the success of science if its essential components are mind-dependent structures rather than simply features of an independent reality? Kant's aims in the critique of pure reason are both modest and ambitious. He wants to outline the limits of what pure reason, resting on its own, can achieve, yet he also wants to preserve the power of science and the possibility of moral philosophy. He is not seeking to dissolve science into mere constructs of the mind, nor is he content with leaving metaphysical questions in a fog of skeptic doubt. The goal is to map the necessary conditions of the possibility of experience and to show how both the sciences and moral life can be grounded in a shared epistemic architecture. In doing so, Kant is setting guardrails: what we can know with certainty, what can be inferred with a high degree of confidence, and what lies beyond the safe reach of theoretical cognition. To make these abstract positions tangible, Kant offers concrete examples that can ground the Copernican turn. The first example concerns the a priori structure found in mathematics and natural science that makes experience intelligible. Consider mathematics. The truths of geometry do not arise out of the sensory world as such. They are not discovered by looking at particular triangles in nature. Instead, geometry prescribes the very form of possible spatial experience. The idea of straight lines, of perfect circles, of the relations of angles and distances, they are not empirical generalizations about the world until we apply them. They are the conditions under which we can even experience space. The mind brings to the table the form of space as an intuition that structures all appearances of outer sense, and so mathematics looks synthetic a priori. It is not merely true by virtue of analysis of the concepts involved, nor is it entirely derived from particular experiences. It extends our knowledge in a way that could not be obtained by mere analysis of concepts. while still being guaranteed by the very structure of human sensibility. A companion example lies in the realm of natural science, particularly Newtonian physics, which reveals the same pattern at a larger scale of experience. The law-like regularities that science seeks, causality, the uniformity of nature, the uniform progression of time, are not mere contingent observations waiting to be stitched together by inductive inference. Rather, causality is a category of the understanding that the mind imposes on sense impressions to render them intelligible as a sequence of events under laws. Without the mind's category of causality, we would have a heap of disjointed sensations. A sudden event here, an apparent regularity there, but no coherent story across time. With causality as part of the mind's furniture, we attend to reasoned order, to explanations that connect effects to antecedent causes. The remarkable fact is that such a form is not derived from experience. It is what makes experience itself possible as coherent, law-governed succession. In this sense, the a priori structures, the forms of intuition, space and time, and the categories of the understanding are the scaffolding that let science do its work with clarity and firmness. In Kant's narrative about the turn, there is a second, no less important, set of illustrations drawn from everyday judgments. These judgments show that our concepts are not passive labels we attach after seeing the world. They actively organize what we perceive. Consider the ordinary way we experience a simple object like a cup on a table. Our perception of the cup's shape, color, and position is immediate. Yet we do not experience those features as isolated scraps of data. Instead, we apply the concept of objecthood to treat the cup as a thing that persists through time, that remains the same object even when its position might vary or its appearance might change with lighting. We apply the category of causality to interpret an event such as the cup tipping over and breaking. We apply the principle of substance to treat the cup as something that bears its properties without dissolving into mere appearances. We apply the causal principle to explain why the cup fell. Perhaps someone nudged it, perhaps it slipped on the wet floor, perhaps a gust of wind from an open window. In short, our ordinary judgments reveal how our concepts organize perception in a way that makes sense of experience as coherent, unified, and intelligible. The mind does not passively echo the world. It plays an active, organizing role. If we want to keep the story faithful to Kant's intent, we should not pretend these examples are merely empirical curiosities. They are for Kant the very grounds that demonstrate the necessity of the Copernican turn. The a priori constitution of the space and time of sensation, together with the innate categories that structure experience, show how empirical science can be both robust and universally reliable because its core form rests on the mind's own architecture. The turn is not a confession of nihilism about knowledge, it is a disciplined reconfiguration of what it means to know something. It invites us to look inward at the conditions of possibility so that outward knowledge can be less of a risk and more of a rigorous, ongoing achievement. It is the wager that the mind's forms are not mere features of interpretation that could be swapped at will, but rather the indispensable conditions under which any knowledge of the world could exist in the first place. As any shift of such magnitude must, it seems, invite controversy, Kant does not dodge the inevitable pushback. There are at least two substantial counterarguments to the Copernican turn that demand serious attention. The first counterargument centers on the worry that making the mind constitutive risks dissolving knowledge into mere constructs. If the mind is shaping or constituting the objects of experience, then what guarantees that our knowledge corresponds to anything real beyond our mental architecture? Could it be that we are simply dealing with a system of thoughts that we mistake for a world? In this line of critique, the worry is that to insist on mind-dependent structures is to risk collapsing knowledge into idealist fashioning, making all scientific claims vulnerable to the charge that they are only about the mind's arrangements rather than about a world that stands independently of us. The fear is not only about skepticism, it is about the loss of objective claim to truth about the world. If we insist that the world is always already organized by our own minds, we might be tempted to claim that there is no world independently of mind, or at least that we have no access to such a world if it exists. The fear is that scientific success could be explained away by the simplicity or convenience of our mental organization, leaving no room for genuine knowledge of nature. The second counterargument arises from a practical concern. If science depends on mind-dependent structures, how can science account for its extraordinary success in the real world? The methods of science, hypotheses, experiments, observations, predictions, have produced incredibly reliable, successful results across centuries and cultures. If the fundamental assumptions of science are already shaped by our cognitive apparatus, does that not undermine the very enterprise science purports to advance? How do we explain that a Newtonian eclipse theory, a Maxwellian electromagnetism, or a quantum mechanical formalism later on all appear to yield precise empirical predictions? Critics ask. If the conditions of possibility are mind-dependent, how can it be that nature appears to conform to those conditions with such fidelity? The fear here is epistemic. Kant's turn might seem to relocate the ground of science from a world independent of us to the mind's own structure, thereby threatening the objectivity that science both requires and earns through its cumulative success. Kant does not meet these objections with a shrug. He is aware that to claim the mind structure's experience is to step into a delicate space where the danger of turning epistemology into ontological idealism is real. His response is twofold, and it is most clearly articulated through the resources of transcendental philosophy. First, he distinguishes between appearances and things in themselves. The mind's constitutive role applies to appearances, the ways in which objects present themselves to consciousness given space, time, and the categories. But the things themselves, the noumena, are not what we can know in theory. They remain, for theoretical knowledge, beyond the reach of any mental construction that the mind might apply to objects. In other words, the mind's structures do not manufacture a world out of nothing. They determine the conditions under which objects can become objects of experience. This is a crucial claim. The determinations the mind imposes are not arbitrary, they are the necessary forms that make experience intelligible. Kant is not saying that there is no world. He is saying that there is a world as it is known to us, and that the shapes and principles of that knowledge come from the mind's own architecture. Second, Kant argues that the success of science, the very fact that the categories and the forms of intuition are so fruitful across domains, constitutes strong support for the view that there is a disciplined order to experience that the mind can reliably access. The a priori structures, such as space and time as forms of intuition and causality as a category of the understanding, do not appear as mere inventions or fictions. They are presupposed by any possible experience that counts as knowledge of nature. And because the scientific method presupposes the regularities of nature and the lawful relations among events, Kant can argue that there is a necessary connection between the mind's structures and the possibility of stable, repeatable experiments and predictions. The mind's contributions are not a recipe for arbitrary creativity, they are the preconditions for meaningful, testable, and coherent science. The mind's own architecture becomes a guarantee of intelligibility, not a guarantee of illusory construction. To anchor these reflections more concretely, we should return to the examples. The a priori structure found in mathematics and natural science is not merely about human convenience. It is about the very way the mind can engage with the world. In mathematics, the forms of space and the logical operations of coordination and abstraction make possible the precise quantification and modeling that underpin physics, engineering, and even the design of artifacts in daily life. In physics, the same forms, space and time as arenas of sensory appearance, and causality as a necessary link in the chain of experience, bind our observations into coherent theories. When physicists describe particles moving in space-time, or when engineers design a bridge to withstand stresses, they are implicitly counting on these a priori structures to hold fast. If those structures were not part of our cognitive makeup, the intelligibility of such descriptions would be suspect. Kant's claim is that such success is best explained not by appeal to mindless repetition of habit or to a purely empirical fit, but to the mind's own role in making experience possible. That is the heart of the Copernican turn. We are not passengers on a world assembled independent of us. We are active participants who shape the very conditions under which objects present themselves to us. The second set of examples, the everyday judgments, brings Kant's claim closer to home. When you see a cup on a table, you do not merely accumulate a heap of sensory qualities, color, texture, temperature, proximity. You naturally interpret this arrangement as an object that persists through time, that can be seen from different angles, that can be moved, and that might be found in other places at different times. If you look again and see the cup is empty or full, depends on the interplay of perception and expectation. The mind's expectation that objects continue to exist even when not directly perceived, or that their features remain stable under ordinary conditions. The ordinary judgments we perform about causation, why something happened, whether it stabilizes the environment, whether one event reliably precedes another, show how our concepts organize perception in real time. The mind's categories of understanding do more than label data. They provide the conceptual framework through which experience is interpreted as cause, effect, substance, and relation. That is not a mere epistemological trick. It is the daily mechanism by which we navigate the world with confidence, by which we plan, act, and reflect. To see how Kant's Copernican turn sits within a historical conversation, it helps to situate him in the broader arc of early modern thought. Before him stood Descartes, who started from radical doubt and built a system on the certainty of the thinking subject, and Leibniz, who tried to reconstruct a rational, entangled cosmos in which all factors fit into a grand, pre-established harmony. They represent the rationalist way of anchoring knowledge in the mind's inherent resources, perhaps with an eye to a metaphysical system that would explain all of reality. Then there were the empiricists Locke, Berkeley, Hume, who pressed the claim that knowledge springs from experience and that ideas are the products of sensation and reflection, with skepticism toward the mind's supposed access to any noumenal realm. Kant stands at a pivotal crossroads between these two lines of thought. He is not just claiming a clever synthesis, he is offering a methodological innovation, a transcendental inquiry into the a priori conditions that make experience and scientific knowledge possible, an inquiry that refuses to reduce either the mind to the world or the world to the mind, but instead asks what the mind must be in order for there to be any meaningful experience of the world at all. To deepen the sense of history and human texture, let us anchor Kant's work with two historical anecdotes that illuminate the world in which he lived and the kind of person he was. First, Kant's famously regimented daily routine and his long walks through Königsberg. The lore about Kant emphasizes a life of almost ceremonial routine. He reportedly arose at the same hour, prayed in the same way, ate predictable meals, and took his long walks at a consistent time each day, often tracing the same route around the city's outskirts and along the river. People could set their clocks by him, so synchronized was his life to the rhythms of Königsberg. The story is not merely a quaint curiosity about a scholarly recluse. It underlines a broader sense of discipline that matches the demands Kant would place on his own mind. The habit of walking, of quiet contemplation, of turning over questions in the mind, is the physical counterpart to a life devoted to thinking, an insistence that clarity comes through habitual, patient work, through time given to the problem rather than through bursts of fevered intensity. The long walks kept him in touch with the real material world, the streets, the bridges, the riverside trees, while his thoughts moved in the more abstract, invisible space where ideas are formed and tested. Second, the cultural milieu of Enlightenment salons and the ongoing debate about human autonomy. Kant's Königsberg was not an isolated island. It was part of a larger European conversation that stretched from the salons of Paris to the universities of Berlin and the scientific societies of London. Enlightenment culture prized reason, autonomy, and the ideal of human progress, but it also recognized the fragility of human judgment and the limits of our control over knowledge. The salons, the lively, often intimate gatherings in which philosophers, scientists, poets, and patrons debated the limits and promises of reason, formed a musical backdrop for Kant's life and work. The conversation about human autonomy, what it means to act according to laws we legislate for ourselves, to reason freely, to be responsible for our own judgments, permeated many disciplines and directions. Kant's own moral philosophy, which would mature in the years after the Critique of Pure Reason, would become a philosophical articulation of autonomy as the essential condition of ethical life. But the seeds of that concern grow out of the broader Enlightenment preoccupation with what it means to be an agent capable of rationally independent judgment. In this historical setting, two counterarguments to the Copernican turn stand out as particularly persistent. The first is the worry that turning to mind as constitutive threatens the very notion of knowledge as a genuine, objective relation to the world. If the mind determines the structure of possible experience, if space, time, and the categories mold the objects we can know, then where do we locate reality beyond or behind these structures? Critics worry that Kant's position could slide into a form of idealism in which the world becomes, at least for theory, a construct of cognitive machinery rather than a thing in itself, an interpretive map that might not correspond to any territory outside the map. The worry is not simply about misrepresentation. It concerns the possibility of robust, objective truth about the external world. If we treat all objects as appearances shaped by cognitive forms, we risk treating science as a set of human-constructed patterns rather than as a description of nature, one that would remain true only insofar as those patterns align with human cognition. The fear is that knowledge could become a mirage of the mind rather than a reliable testimony about an independent reality. The second counterargument challenges the explanatory power of a mind-dependent framework to account for science's extraordinary success. Science has, after all, produced precise predictions, powerful technologies, and incredibly accurate models of the natural world, from planetary motion to the behavior of subatomic particles. If the mind's forms are the primary architects of experience, How is it that the world often behaves in ways that science can predict with impressive accuracy across cultures and centuries? How can one account for the universality of scientific laws if these laws are ultimately anchored in the particular cognitive architecture of human beings rather than in an objective, mind-independent realm? Critics may press Kant to show how the mind's structures do more than coherently organize data. They must also account for why the world should conform to those structures so reliably. If the forms of intuition, the categories, and the synthetic a priori judgments are mere projections of our minds, then science would rely on a kind of internal logic whose success would require explanation beyond the empirical. Yet science would seem to fail to address the stubborn fact that the world, in its own terms, remains accessible and intelligible in remarkably consistent ways. Kant meets these challenges not by retreating into dogmatic reassurance, but by refining the terms of the debate. He refrains from declaring that there is no world beyond the mind, and he refuses to surrender to the claim that all knowledge is relative, hypothetical, or merely conventional. Instead, he articulates a cautious, disciplined middle path. The mind does contribute to the shape and content of experience, yet this contribution is not arbitrary. The necessary forms of sensibility and understanding, space, time, causality, unity, and the array of logical categories, are not chosen at whim. They are part of what makes experience itself possible. The noumenal realm, the things in themselves, cannot be made into objects of theoretical knowledge. We cannot reach beyond appearances to grasp the world as it is in itself. But that very limitation, paradoxically, preserves a durable ethical and scientific program. We are left with a secure domain where science can operate with credibility because the mind's structures provide a stable ground for experience. And we are left with a robust sense of autonomy and dignity for moral agency, because the moral law within us, as a claim that binds rational beings to universal duties, emerges not as a mere byproduct of cognitive architecture, but as a necessary postulate of practical reason, a claim about how we ought to act. Cross-references to early modern rationalists and empiricists are not mere footnotes but vital continuities in the argument. Descartes, with his meditations on the self as thinking thing, and Leibniz, with his pre-established harmony and his belief in a rational order of the universe, provide the intellectual scaffolding upon which Kant both leans and corrects. Kant's own move can be read as an attempt to salvage the rationalist confidence in the power of reason and the empiricist insistence on the primacy of experience, by insisting that reason's power is not unlimited and experience is not a mere passive reception. His position resonates with Hume's critique of causal necessity and induction, even as Kant reasserts that causality is not something we simply observe in the world. It is a necessary condition of the way in which the mind organizes experience. The famous claim that thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind, encapsulates this synthesis and marks the awkward but fruitful alliance Kant forges between rational organization and empirical content. The mind's activity is real, but it does not create a world from nothing. It shapes the field of possible experience within which a mind-independent world can be known as appearances. A related set of reflections concerns the distinction between appearances, Erscheinungen, and things in themselves, Ding and Sich. Kant's insistence here is not merely technical, it carries ethical and epistemological gravity. The appearances are what we can know, with the forms of space, time, and the categories giving them coherence and lawfulness. The things in themselves, the noumena, remain resistant to theoretical knowledge. We cannot just reach beyond appearances with a telescope of pure reason and lay hold of a realm that lies beyond the mind's organizing structures. Yet, the very idea that there is more than merely appearances provides the necessary horizon for metaphysical reflection. God, freedom, and immortality may hold themselves up as practical postulates, as claims that rational beings must adopt to make sense of moral obligation and the possibility of a legitimate political order. This is where Kant's Copernican turn is not merely a theory of perception, but a philosophical program that attempts to ground ethics as well as epistemology within a coherent, disciplined framework. The ripple effects of Kant's turn were felt immediately and then across decades and continents. In the decades after the critique of pure reason, Kant's method influenced generations of philosophers who would expand, refine, or critique his claims. The German idealists Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel would take Kant's insights and run with them, turning the question of how the mind constructs reality into a dramatic quest about the absolute, self-consciousness, and the unfolding of rationality. In Britain and France, philosophers and scientists would wrestle with Kant's insistence on the a priori conditions of experience while drawing on empirical science to ground biological, psychological, and social claims. The Copernican turn thus becomes not a retreat from the world but a reconfiguration of how we engage with the world, as it pushes us to ask, what does it mean to know? What are the conditions of the possibility of knowledge? How does moral reasoning arise within a framework that is both grounded in our cognitive architecture and oriented toward universalizable norms? To feel the force of Kant's project, we can also take a look at the way he welcomes the role of human autonomy. The Enlightenment's ardor for freedom of inquiry, for the capacity to think and judge for oneself, runs through Kant's later moral philosophy with the concept of a rational agent bound by universal law. The moral life in Kant's hands is not a matter of private inclination or of sentiment alone. It is a matter of rational commitment to the principle that one should act in a way that could be willed as a universal law. The famous formula, often associated with Kant's broader moral vision and echoed later in the public sphere of modern political life, emerges from his sense that even in the theory of knowledge we must attend to the autonomy of the rational agent. We must treat ourselves and others as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end. This is a powerful claim about human dignity and the possibility of ethical life grounded in reason. The Copernican turn feeds into this moral dimension by showing that rational structure is not simply a private matter of cognition, but a universal condition of capable, principled agency. If we listen for Kant's own voice in the dialogue with the past, we can hear the echo of his own words that the mind organizes the world in which we live. The famous line about the two things that fill the mind with awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within, summons not only the scientific wonder at the cosmos, but also the interior duty that binds human beings to one another. It is a twofold invitation to marvel at the order of nature and to heed the moral order that grounds our obligations. The Copernican turn thus becomes not a retreat into mere relativism or subjectivity, but a demanding, rigorous claim that reason, when disciplined and properly directed, can illuminate both the natural world and the ethical life. This is the core of Kant's ambition, to carve out a space in which science can flourish under the demand of rational justification, and where morality gains a foundation that is both universal and feasible within the limits of human knowledge. To bring the scene full circle, it is helpful to restate the purpose of this turn in concrete lived terms. Consider an ordinary act of learning, a student studying a physics textbook, a child learning to count, a physician diagnosing a patient, a citizen deliberating about a political issue. Each of these acts depends on assumptions about space, time, causality, and the stability of objects over time. Each depends on the mind's capacity to apply the formal structures of understanding to sensory input in a way that renders the world comprehensible and navigable. The Copernican turn in Kant's hands reframes the very act of knowing as a partnership between mind and world. The world offers its order to our minds, but that order is not discovered in a neutral, pre-existing form. It is produced by the mind's own capacities. The result is a double freedom. Freedom for science, which can explore nature's laws because there is a stable, intelligible structure in the human mind that makes law-like descriptions possible. Freedom for ethics, which emerges from our capacity to legislate for ourselves rationally, to act from universalizable maxims rather than from contingent impulses. If the 18th century asked whether human beings could stand up to the demands of reason, Kant answered with a robust yes. And in answering, he offered a map for continued reflection that has guided philosophers, scientists, and political thinkers for centuries. In the ensuing sections of this course, you will see how these ideas unfold across epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, how they relate to debates with Descartes, Leibniz, and Hume, and how they drive contemporary reflections on science, perception, and moral life. The Copernican turn is not a single moment, but a method, a way of asking what must be true about the mind for experience to be possible. What must be true about experience for science to be meaningful, and for morality to have force? Kant's life in Königsberg, his patient, methodical labor, and his willingness to enter the fray of Enlightenment debate all converge in this ambitious program. He embraced the task not as a retreat from the world, but as an invitation to understand how we, as rational beings, participate in the making of knowledge and in the making of a human life that can be morally lived. And yet, even as we invite this hopeful, disciplined vision, we should keep close two practical reminders. First, the Copernican turn is a theoretical commitment about the conditions for knowledge, not a vague optimism that the mind can conjure any world it pleases. It is, in that sense, a sober methodological decision, to ask what conditions must be in place for experience to be possible, and to examine those conditions with rigor. This is why Kant's project in the Critique is so exacting. It requires attention to the structure of human cognition, to the particularities of the forms of perception, and to the logical architecture of the arguments by which we substantiate claims about the world. Second, we should remember that Kant's own project never loses sight of the moral dimension. If science seeks to explain the laws of nature, ethics seeks to guide how we live within the framework of rational autonomy. The two tracks converge when we consider the status of human reason itself as a rational agent who must be free, responsible, and worthy of respect. In Kant's hands, the Copernican turn is not just a technical move. It is a program for clarifying what it means to know, to be human, and to act justly in a world we can only know through the mind's own organizing light. To close with a few reflections from primary voices that illuminate the path we have followed, we can recall Kant's own sense that knowledge begins in experience, yet does not arise from it in a simple way. All our knowledge begins with experience, but it does not follow that it arises from experience. This paradox lies at the heart of the Copernican turn and the entire enterprise of critical philosophy. It is a reminder that our points of view are not mere passive mirrors held up to the world. They are active, productive, and deeply consequential for what we can know, what we can justify, and how we should live. And we can hear, as well in the moral mood of his time, the call to treat rational beings not as means but as ends. A principle that resonates in ethics, politics, and human relations. A principle that the appearance of a starry sky above and a moral law within each of us begins to render not as a dream of abstraction, but as a lived commitment to reason's rightful claims. If you listen again to the invitation in Kant's voice, you may hear two enduring echoes. One is an invitation to humility, to recognize that the mind's structures shape our experience, and that there is a limit to what we can know by theoretical inquiry about the things in themselves. The other is an invitation to ambition, to trust that the powers of human reason, when disciplined by careful critique, can illuminate legitimate questions in science and ethics, and can keep faith with the possibility of a just and humane life. The Copernican turn thus becomes both a compass and a horizon, a compass that guides us to attend to the mind's active role in shaping experience, and a horizon that invites us to imagine a rationally ordered cosmos in which knowledge and virtue are possible. This is the living frame of Kant's life, his method, and his turn, the slow, patient, exacting harvest of a thinker who lived in Königsberg but who wrote for the ages, who walked the same streets for decades, and who, with a quiet but steady insistence, pointed philosophy toward questions that still challenge us today. Imagine walking into a room where the walls themselves seem to tilt and rearrange as you move. Not literally, of course, but in a sense so fundamental that every object you encounter, every shape, every event, every line of reasoning, arrives to you already organized by ways your mind must be prepared to receive it. This is the starting point of transcendental epistemology as Kant presents it, that space, time, and the categories of the understanding are not features of the world we happen to observe, but the conditions under which we can ever experience a world at all. In this two-pillar structure, the first pillar is transcendental aesthetics, where space and time are the forms of intuition through which objects appear to us. The second pillar is transcendental logic, where the mind brings order through the categories of the understanding. These two together, space and time as the medium of experience, and the categories as the tools by which experience is synthesized, give us a way to understand how Kant thinks mathematics can deliver synthetic a priori knowledge, and how experience itself is structured so that laws, explanations, and predictions can stand in a single coherent system. Let me begin with transcendental aesthetics, the part of Kant's philosophy that asks what makes experience intelligible in the first place. Space and time, he argues, are not empirical concepts that we derive from repeated experience. They are not the same as the ordinary ideas of distance or duration we might obtain through experience. Rather, they are the forms of sensibility, the pure, a priori conditions of outer and inner intuition. Space is the form of outer intuition, the way we must structure our reception of objects that lie outside us. Time is the form of inner intuition, the way we organize our own states of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and the succession of experiencing. When Kant writes that space is the form of outer intuition, and time is the form of inner intuition, he is not claiming that space and time are deduced from experiences. He is saying that without these forms, we could not have any coherent experience of outer objects or our inner states at all. They do not depend on the particular things we encounter. They are the preconditions for there to be anything at all to encounter. To grasp why this matters for knowledge, we should consider how these forms give mathematics its power. Mathematics, especially geometry and arithmetic, purports to tell us truths about the form and structure of our experience. Geometry speaks of shapes, lengths, angles, and the relationships between them, and arithmetic speaks of numbers and arithmetic operations. But Kant is quick to insist that geometry does more than merely analyze our given sensations or parse our words. He argues that geometry yields synthetic a priori knowledge. Propositions that are informative and extend our knowledge, yet are knowable independently of particular experiences. They are not analytic truths. They do not merely reveal what is contained within the concept of triangle or space by analysis of concepts alone. Rather, they tell us something genuine about the form of space as we experience it, something we could not know merely by analyzing language or the content of particular empirical cases. And they are a priori in the sense that their necessity and universality do not come from experience. They are the conditions that make empirical science possible, yet they are not derived from experience but rather preconditions for it. Consider a concrete example, the geometry of triangles and the certainty of mathematical truths as synthetic a priori. When we consider a Euclidean triangle, we can ask, what is the sum of the angles? In Euclidean space, it is a theorem that the sum of the interior angles equals 2 right angles. How should we understand this? If we take analysis alone, the analysis of what we mean by triangle and by angle, one might think that the claim is analytic. The sum must be equal to 180 degrees by virtue of the definitions themselves. But Kant insists it is synthetic. It is not contained in the concept of a triangle or the concept of angle in isolation. The truth that the interior angles sum to 2 right angles reveals a feature of space itself, a feature that cannot be deduced purely from analyzing the terms. It is a synthetic addition to our knowledge about space, yet in making such a claim we do not appeal to particular empirical instances of triangles we might observe in the world. Instead, we appeal to the form of space which structures all appearances. And the reason we can know such a proposition with necessity is that space, as the form of outer intuition, prescribes a certain coherence to the way shapes and directions can be arranged. This is the sense in which geometry yields synthetic a priori knowledge. The proposition about the sum of angles is not true by mere virtue of the meanings of triangle and angle alone. It is true in virtue of the way space must appear to us given the form of sensibility. The claim is universal and necessary, and yet it is not something discovered by begging questions from experience. It is guaranteed by the very way we must experience space. To make this concrete and relatable, think of how our daily lives rely on a geometric framework that we do not question each morning. The sense that if we lay down a straight ruler and draw a line from one point to another, the shortest path between those 2 points lies along the straight line in a plane, and the notion of parallel lines remains invariant across the plane. When those concepts are tested in ordinary life, we are confident not because we have proven them through countless experiments, but because our mode of intuition, space as a form of outer intuition, prescribes a structural coherence to our experiences. And when we advance to non-Euclidean geometries in modern physics or to curved spaces in general relativity, the structure of space itself becomes more complex, yet Kant's claim holds a certain force. Any history of science that relies on geometry as the language of form presupposes a form of space that is accessible to us as an intuition. He would not hold that we can reach space purely by conceptual reflection. Rather, we have an a priori intuition of space as the condition under which objects appear in the first place. Time, too, plays a crucial role in how mathematics helps us grasp the world. Time is the form of inner intuition, the condition under which states of consciousness unfold. How does time function in mathematical knowledge? In arithmetic and the calculus, we rely on the idea that processes unfold in time in a uniform, law-like way. The laws of motion, for instance, not only predict how a moving body travels through time but also require a temporal structure to be meaningful. There must be a before and an after, a progression that allows us to talk about rates, accelerations, and derivatives. The continuity of time and the linearity we ordinarily assume are not features of the world out there as such. They are the forms by which we can experience change. Kant claims that such temporal forms are necessary for the possibility of experience of change. Without time as a form of inner intuition, our experiences of successive appearances would be a mere jumble, a disconnected set of states with no connective order. Therefore, mathematics, including physics, relies crucially on space and time as the forms through which our senses reach intuitions that can be organized and governed by universal laws. This leads to the broader claim about how mathematics can be synthetic a priori. If the mathematical propositions were analytic, they would be true by virtue of the meanings of the terms alone. If they were a posteriori, they would rest on particular experiences. Kant's critical move is to locate a third possibility. Mathematical knowledge is synthetic because it adds something to our concepts that is not contained within them, yet it is a priori because it does not depend on a specific experience. The geometry of Euclidean space, for instance, tells us something new about how space must be arranged, and yet its necessity and universality come from the fact that space is the form of outer intuition we all share as experiencing agents. The same goes for arithmetic, where the law of addition, for example, is not just a definitional truth, but a law that must hold across all possible experiences, because time as the form of inner intuition gives us a framework in which counting and succession can be meaningful and consistent. Kant's approach is not simply a defense of mathematics as a mysterious, ring-fenced realm of reason. It also has a dramatic consequence for how we understand science, especially natural science. If space and time are the universal forms of intuition, and if the categories of the understanding, substance, causality, unity, plurality, and the rest, are the core concepts by which we organize all appearances, then the laws of physics are not discovered by peering at the world and seeing what is there, and then generalizing from experience. Rather, the laws of physics are in part the visible expression of these a priori conditions under which appearances can be experienced and compared. In other words, physics finds its footing in the way we, as knowers, are structured. The world is knowable in certain ways because our minds bring to bear these a priori forms that shape the content of what we can experience. Let us move from space and time to the next portion of the transcendental architecture, the transcendental logic, and with it the categories of the understanding. If space and time are the forms of sensibility that shape all intuition, then the mind also possesses a set of pure concepts, the categories that actively contribute to making experience possible. Kant enumerates them as the most general, a priori concepts of the understanding: unity, plurality, totality, succession and simultaneity, modality, relation, quantity, quality, and crucially for science, causality, substance, and the various forms of connection and synthesis. These categories are not empirical notions derived from experience. They are preconditions for thinking experiences as coherent objects and events. Without the category of causality, we would not understand sequences of events as having a lawful order. Without the category of substance, we would not think of objects as persisting through time. Without unity, plurality, or totality, we would be unable to organize diverse appearances into an integrated experience. The categories are the mind's way of condensing the manifold of intuition into a coherent story, one that can be said to have a structure, a pattern, a law. To understand how the categories work, it helps to contrast analytic and synthetic judgments more carefully. An analytic judgment is one where the predicate concept is contained within the subject concept. For example, every hollow sphere is round. The concept of hollow sphere entails the property of being round through the analysis of the terms involved. There is no new information added by asserting the predicate. The truth is contained in the meaning of the terms. A synthetic judgment, by contrast, adds something not contained in the concept of the subject. The apple is red is synthetic because the property red is not contained in the concept of apple. A priori synthetic judgments are particularly surprising. They extend knowledge and yet do so independently of experience. Geometry often yields synthetic a priori truths, as we have seen, by revealing spatial relations that are not analytic in the sense of mere definitional content, but are nonetheless guaranteed by the form of sensibility. Likewise, in natural science, there is the claim that the laws governing causal relations, planetary motion, or the laws of thermodynamics are synthetic a priori in the sense that they structure how we experience the world and yet are not purely derived from experience. Kant's claim about the categories is that they are the organizing principles by which sense impressions are brought into unity. When we encounter a sequence of events, a ball rolling, a planet orbiting, a chemical reaction unfolding, we do not simply register raw impressions. We interpret them through the lens of causality. The category of causality obliges us to see such sequences as law-governed processes in which one state of affairs brings about another. The category of substance tells us to treat objects as things that endure through time despite change in their properties. The category of unity and plurality guides us in grouping phenomena into wholes and parts. Without these categories, the mind would be unable to synthesize the manifold of appearances into coherent objects and events. With them, experience becomes intelligible. With them, we may predict, explain, and even formulate mathematical and physical laws that unify disparate observations. To illustrate these ideas with concrete action, consider two examples that Kant himself would likely emphasize. The first is causal reasoning in everyday life and science. Suppose you are watching a sequence of events. A match is struck, the flame appears, and then the flame grows, producing a light and heat. If you were to suspend your belief in universal causality, you might still observe that this particular sequence occurs. but you would not be able to predict what will happen next in any systematic way. The moment you commit to the causal view that the match's striking causes the flame to appear and the flame to spread under certain conditions, you are applying the category of causality. That presumption yields meaningful predictions. If the match is struck but the room is full of damp air, the flame may fail. If the air is dry and oxygen-rich, the flame may flare more brightly. In scientific practice, this is extended to planetary motion, chemical reactions, and seemingly idiomatic regularities of nature. The mind, by applying the category of causality, organizes a stream of appearances into a causal series, enabling us to forecast outcomes and test theories. The force of Kant's position here is not that causality is simply observed in the world. It is a constitutive feature of the way we experience the world. Causality is, in a sense, the mind's indispensable schema for turning a sequence of unrelated appearances into a meaningful story with cause and effect, explanation and prediction. The second example lies with geometry once again and the synthetic nature of geometric knowledge that extends beyond mere analysis. Consider a geometrical proposition such as the Pythagorean theorem in Euclidean space. In a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. To someone who merely analyzes the term triangle and burdens it with the definitions of sides and angles, there may seem to be no new information beyond the definitions themselves. But geometry as a discipline reveals a deeper claim about space that is not contained in the concept of a triangle alone. It asserts a universal relation among the lengths of sides in Euclidean space as contingent on the space's curvature and straightness. The theorem thus shows that geometry does not merely analyze terms, it expands our knowledge of the structure of space as such. And in this sense, geometry provides a paradigmatic example of a synthetic a priori judgment. It is informative, it is necessary, and it is independent of any single empirical observation. It tells us something true about space itself, a truth that must hold for any possible experience, given the form of sensibility Kant calls space. But the story does not stop with these examples. Kant also aims to show how the categories of the understanding participate in the synthesis of all experience. The synthesis occurs when our manifold of intuitions, the raw material we receive through the senses and inside our inner life, are united under categories to form objects of experience, events, and causal relations. The unity of consciousness, the persistence of objects, the identification of causes, and the lawful regularities of nature, all these are possible only because the mind brings to bear the categories. The result is a world that is not merely a heap of appearances, but a structured field of objects and events that can be studied, tested, and manipulated conceptually. This is how Kant thinks mathematics can be extended to science, and how natural science can claim universal laws. It is not that space, time, and the categories provide matter out there. Rather, they supply the architecture that makes matter intelligible to us as knowers. As we turn toward the more skeptical terrain, two major counterarguments to Kant's program demand serious attention. The first is a Humean challenge about causal necessity. David Hume famously argued that our belief in necessity and causation arises not from any observed, necessary connection in the world, but from habitual associations we form after repeatedly witnessing constant conjunctions. If we only observe constant conjunctions, A followed by B, how can we claim there is any necessary connection? Kant's response is intricate and crucial. He concedes that we do not observe the necessity of causation in the sense that we see necessary connection with the senses. But he insists that the mind imposes a form of necessity in order to make experience possible at all. Causality is a category, a synthetic a priori principle that structures how events can be experienced. Without the mind's commitment to causality, appearances would not cohere into a predictable order. We would experience a mere torrent of uncontrollable episodes rather than a law-governed world. So Kant's reply to Hume is not to deny that we rely on habit or that experience can be regular. It is to insist that causal necessity is a feature of the mind's architecture, not a feature of the world as such. The world exists for us as the world that can be understood only through the a priori structure of the mind, which includes the category of causality. The second counterargument is a late modern challenge to Kant's claim that space and time are mind-dependent forms of intuition. In contemporary philosophy, as well as physics, there are powerful challenges to the idea that space and time are merely forms of our sensibility. Relativity and the dynamical geometry of spacetime and general relativity show that space and time are deeply intertwined with physical fields and the distribution of matter and energy. If spacetime is not a fixed, mind-structured background, but something that actively interacts with mass and energy, some philosophers wonder whether Kant's claim that space and time are forms of intuition can remain secure. If space and time can be shaped by physical processes and can, in certain regimes, seem to be contingent or relational rather than purely form-like, does that undermine the idea that our cognitive architecture imposes these forms to guarantee universal knowledge? Kant's defense in A Modern Key is often to tighten the distinction between the transcendental and the empirical. Space and time, as forms of intuition, are the conditions for the possibility of experience for any experiencing subject. The content of space in the physical world, including its geometry and its dynamical properties, can vary according to scientific theories and empirical findings. The transcendental thesis remains that for there to be any experience at all, there must be a structuring form. The empirical complexity of physics does not dissolve this claim, but it forces a rediculation. The geometry of the world as science describes it may be more sophisticated than Euclidean geometry, yet the mind's structural role persists as the ground of intelligibility. These counterarguments, however, invite a broader historical and philosophical conversation about how Kant's ideas have fared over time. Two historical anecdotes will illuminate how his project emerged and how it interacted with the ideas of others, shaping both Kant's confidence and later developments in philosophy. First, the mid-18th century debate between rationalists and empiricists about the foundations of geometry and physics. On the rationalist side, figures such as Leibniz and Wolff argued that the mind possesses innate principles and that mathematical truths could be known independently of experience through reason. Leibniz, for instance, often pressed the relational view of space. Space is not an external container, but a system of relations among things. He was something of a rival to Newton in these debates, with a more relational view of space. Against this, the empiricists, Locke and later Berkeley, emphasized that all knowledge begins with sensory experience and that the content of our ideas comes from what is given to us through perception. Locke famously claimed that the mind starts as a blank slate, writing content on it as experience unfolds. Berkeley pushed the idealist line, arguing that what we call matter is a bundle of perceived ideas. There is no external material substance beyond perception. The mid-century flux between these views illuminated a central question that Kant would later attempt to answer with his transcendental synthesis. Can geometry and physics be grounded in some a priori structure of the mind, or must they be traced to experience and empirical content? Kant provides a nuanced middle way. Geometry is synthetic a priori because it is grounded in the forms of sensibility, but he also recognizes that geometry must be tested against experience and that the content of geometric claims in physics can take shape within the empirical world. A second historical anecdote concerns Newtonian science and the shaping of Kant's confidence in the power of a priori structure. Newton's laws of motion, gravitation, and the mathematical organization of the physical world provided a powerful demonstration of how mathematical form and law-like regularities could organize seemingly disparate phenomena. Kant admired Newton's success and took it as an instance of how the world could be made intelligible through the proper use of a priori structure. The Newtonian program suggested that the natural world is accessible to human reason through universal laws expressible in mathematics, and Kant took this as support for the idea that space and time, and the categories of causality and substance, are not arbitrary but intimately tied to the structure of experience through which science proceeds. The success of Newtonian dynamics in explaining planetary motion, tides, and orbital mechanics gave Kant reason to think that a priori principles could account for the orderliness of nature. This historical moment is crucial. It situates Kant's transcendental program not as a mere epistemic curiosity, but as a response to and an extension of the best scientific achievements of his day. He sought to ground the power of mathematics and physics by locating their power in the mind's own architecture. This historical frame also helps us connect Kant to a broader intellectual lineage. He did not write in a vacuum. He offers sustained cross-references to thinkers like Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, and Leibniz, and he engages with the logic and math that Frege would later formalize in the analytic tradition. The Cartesian tradition, Descartes in particular, laid down a strong early program for mathematics and geometry as a foundation for knowledge. Cartesian coordinates and analytic geometry show how space can be understood through a system of coordinates that provide a purely formal account of spatial relations. Kant respects that move but adds a twist. While Descartes shows how geometry can be codified, Kant shows why geometry does more than codify. It yields knowledge about space that is anchored in the forms of sensibility. The empiricists, particularly Locke and Berkeley, challenged the notion that geometry and mathematics can be known a priori in the sense Kant claims. Kant replies by differentiating the source of mathematical knowledge from mere empirical observation. It arises from the mind's own structural needs for experience. Leibniz, with his relational view of space and time, is at once a partner and a foil, pushing Kant to face the possibility that the mind's architecture might be more intimately tied to relational structure than he may have originally thought. Frege, writing later in the analytic tradition, raises the question of whether mathematics is truly grounded in logic, or whether the a priori status of mathematics rests on different grounds. The reception by phenomenology and analytic philosophy, Husserl's transcendental reduction and later debates about the a priori, Frege's logic and Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction, further enriches the story. Kant's project, then, is not simply a historical curiosity. It becomes a seed from which later debates about the nature of a priori knowledge, the status of mathematics, and the role of intuition in logic would grow. As these threads show, the section on transcendental epistemology in Kant's system cannot be reduced to a dry taxonomy of terms. It is, rather, a living narrative about how we come to know anything at all. In one sense, space and time form the medium of all experience. Without them, no object would appear, no change would be intelligible, and no science would claim universal laws. In another sense, the categories of the understanding supply the framework by which those appearances are organized into coherent knowledge, unity from plurality, persistence of substances, causal connections, and the like. The analytic project, distinguishing analytic from synthetic judgments, provides the vocabulary with which Kant wants to describe what mathematics achieves when it claims synthetic a priori status. The claim that mathematics yields synthetic a priori knowledge rests on the claim that mathematics reveals the necessary forms of intuition and the a priori structures of understanding that generate the unity of experience. Now, to bring the thread together and to show how Kant's project continues to resonate, we should acknowledge the ongoing dialogue with later philosophers. In phenomenology, Husserl's method of transcendental reduction seeks to uncover the conditions for the possibility of experience by bracketing the naive natural attitude. Husserl's emphasis on consciousness and its intentional structures is a modern echo of Kant's insistence that certain conditions of possibility lie within the mind. Husserl would ask, in effect, how does the act of intending objects in time and in space reveal what is given, what is meant, and what is meant to be essential? The answer for Kant would be that transcendental phenomenology is an echo of the philosopher who asked what the mind must be like to experience anything at all, and the latter inquiry remains a central preoccupation for phenomenology. In analytic philosophy, Frege's logic and the subsequent work on the foundations of mathematics attempt to rebuild mathematics on a formal basis. Frege's project was to show that arithmetic can be reduced to logic, thereby securing a rigorous basis for mathematical knowledge. The Kantian claim that mathematics rests on a priori synthetic judgments offers a different perspective. Mathematics is not merely logic, nor is it entirely independent of intuition. Instead, it is grounded in the preconditions of experience, and as such, it remains an intriguing borderland between logic, mathematics, and phenomenology of perception. The analytic tradition, in turn, has complicated Kant's a priori by challenging the analytic-synthetic distinction itself. Quine's critique suggests that the very sense of a priori knowledge could be revisable in light of empirical content and theoretical revision. These dialogues do not simply close Kant's project, they push it to new frontiers, where the questions about the nature of space, time, causality, and the structure of thought keep inviting fresh interpretations. If we turn now to a few more primary sources and give a nod to the living tradition that keeps Kant's insights alive in contemporary thought, we can see how a few lines function like a compass in a storm. There are well-known compact lines from Kant that still ring with force in a modern classroom. One is the succinct, almost stark reminder: space is the form of outer intuition. Time is the form of inner intuition. When Kant puts it this way, he is not indulgent in a rhetorical flourish. He is claiming a real and sometimes unsettling polarity. That the very possibility of outer perception depends on spatial intuition, while the inner life, our thoughts, memories, and moods, unfolds temporally in time. Another is the provocative maxim: thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. This line crystallizes the idea that to think and to experience, we must have both content and form. Neither content nor form can stand alone. Without content, thought would be empty. Without form, intuition would be chaotic. The mind's job is to bring them into unity, an act that yields the knowledge that science seeks. And yet the conversation does not stop here. In the course of the last 2 centuries, Kant's transcendental project has been read, reread, and reinterpreted through many lenses. In phenomenology, the demand is to examine how things present themselves to consciousness under various intentional and constitutive conditions, which often involves rethinking the priority of the givenness of objects and how their appearances are structured by intentional acts. In analytic philosophy, the question becomes how much of Kant's a priori structure can survive the logical reconstruction of mathematics and language as the engine of scientific knowledge. Some would argue that the priori is not a property of the mind's structure, but a feature of the language we use to describe experience. Others would insist that the mind's forms, though possibly revised, still play a crucial role in how we can have any knowledge at all. The point is not to settle a single verdict here, but to show that Kant's project opened up a frontier in which questions about mind, world, science, and language intersect in a way that remains provocative, challenging, and deeply clarifying. In this sense, to read Kant's transcendental aesthetics and transcendental logic is to engage with a program that seeks not merely to defend certain claims about knowledge, but to explain the very possibility of intelligible experience. Space and time are not mere backdrops, they are the active scaffolding through which all appearances are arranged. The categories are not just descriptive tools, they are the preconditions for what counts as a thing, a cause, a unity, a plurality. The analytic critique of judgments, the critique of the conditions for the possibility of knowledge, becomes not only a methodological program, but also a metaphysical claim about what the mind contributes to experience. This is what makes Kant both bold and difficult. He asks us to consider the very architecture of thought as the source of knowledge, while inviting us to test that architecture against the ways science has advanced beyond his own time. Let me conclude by reflecting on what this means for a living philosophy of knowledge. If space and time are the forms of intuition, then mathematics is the most lucid window into how our minds shape experience. The certainty of mathematical presuppositions, the a priori, the necessarily true, the universal, depends on the claim that certain structures of experience are not contingent but required for any experience to be possible. If the categories of understanding guide the synthesis of appearances into coherent experience, then our ordinary and scientific knowledge rests on a framework that is largely invisible to us. We trust that a spring day will give way to the day's sequence of light and warmth, and we trust in the causal regularities that govern the world because we assume that events do not occur at random, but in lawful succession. The power of Kant's project lies not in solving every debate about space, time, and causality, but in offering a powerful, compact account of why we can know anything with certainty. He provides a way to understand both the success of mathematics and the fruitfulness of empirical science by appealing to the mind's own architecture. In the end, the two pillars, transcendental aesthetics and transcendental logic, do more than fix a technical vocabulary for a theory of knowledge. They point to a deep continuity between how we experience the world and how we know about it. They imply that the border between what is given and what is known is not a straightforward boundary, but a zone of creative collaboration. Where space and time prefigure the heat of experience, and where the categories of understanding give form to the flux of appearances in ways that make science possible. The mind's investment in these structures is not a mere assumption. It is a structural necessity for any possible experience that can be described, predicted, or tested. The conclusion Kant invites us to accept is both humble and grand. We must acknowledge that much of what we hold to be knowledge is necessarily shaped by the mind's own architecture. And yet the very power of science, mathematics, and inquiry testifies to the extraordinary efficacy of those a priori conditions in generating a coherent, fruitful understanding of the world. So as you reflect on the two pillars, you can feel the cadence of a single, united project. Space and time, as forms of intuition, organize all that appears to us. The categories of the understanding, as pure concepts, organize the synthesis of that appearance into objects, events, and theories. Mathematics finds its grounding in these structures. Its truths are synthetic and a priori, not analytical by virtue of vocabulary alone, but informative by virtue of the form of space and the logic of numbers and relations. Causality under the auspices of the category of understanding allows us to predict, explain, and test. And the entire enterprise, from what Descartes began with clear and distinct ideas to what Berkeley argued about perception, and what Leibniz and Frege challenged in their own ways, ends up in the same orbit. That knowledge, the science of structure and law, arises when mind and world meet in a disciplined form of reasoning that is at once humble about the mysteries of nature and bold about the capacities of human thought. In hearing these claims, you might also hear the echoes of a larger conversation about the nature of knowledge itself. Descartes laid a claim to certainty grounded in clear and distinct ideas, a rationalist tradition that saw reason as the primary path to truth. Locke and Berkeley pushed us to attend to experience, to the content of perception, to the limits of what can be known through sense. Leibniz offered a sophisticated relational picture of space and time that would later challenge Kant to refine his own position. Frege pressed the mathematics-logic axis into a sharp focus, and Husserl, in a different key, asked us to examine the conditions under which anything can be presented to consciousness. The long arc leads to contemporary debates in philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. How far can we push the a priori? How do the structures of logic and mathematical reasoning relate to the empirical content of theory, and what exactly is the role of intuition in the most abstract sciences? Kant does not settle every corresponding debate. Rather, he provides a robust framework that invites ongoing interpretation, critique, and refinement. As you listen to these reflections, you might pause to consider how they bear on your own experience of knowledge. When you learn a new mathematical theorem, when you use a physical law to predict outcomes, when you reason through a causal chain, or when you examine how we interpret space and time in light of new physics, you are, in a subtle way, testifying to Kant's program. You are encountering a form of epistemology that does not reduce knowledge to mere data or to mere analyzing of terms, but instead asks how our very capacity to know frames what counts as knowledge, what counts as certainty, and what counts as explanation. That is the living edge of transcendental epistemology. It asks not only what we know, but how we know it, and why our knowledge takes the form that it does. In this sense, the two pillars are not merely a historical footnote in a philosopher's project. They are a living invitation to reflect on the architecture of mind that makes experience possible, the scaffolding that upholds science, and the horizon of human inquiry where past debates with Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Leibniz, and Frege continue to echo in the shape of modern phenomenology and analytic philosophy. And if you listen closely, you will hear, in Kant's own words and through the voices of later thinkers, a testament to the stubborn but hopeful claim that there is a coherent, intelligible structure to our knowing, even if that structure is as much a feature of the mind as a map of the world. Imagine a dead calm in the late 18th century air, when philosophers in Europe were feverishly trying to map the territory of knowledge itself. The old metaphysical ambitions to crown science with the certainty of first principles, to prove God's existence from reason alone, to anchor freedom in a necessary world order, were being shaken from their high perches by new questions, new experiments of thought, and the quiet, stubborn skepticism that comes when the mind looks hard at its own machinery. Into that liminal space steps Immanuel Kant, a thinker who does not so much reject metaphysics as relocate its stakes. He asks, what can reason legitimately claim to know, and where does it overstep? If we want to have a science of nature that is reliable, what must we grant about the limits of what we can know? And if we want a moral life to hold with any seriousness, how can we still speak of duties, purposes, and values without pretending we have access to the final nature of things? This is the central aim of Kant's critique of pure reason, the aim Kant sets out in a careful wager about how human beings come to know anything at all. He wants to diagnose the moment when reason, in its zeal to generalize from appearances to the things themselves, overreaches. He wants to rescue science from the grandest metaphysical fantasies while preserving the most essential structure of our rational life. He wants to show that science can describe appearances with astonishing reliability, but that it cannot and must not pretend to knowledge of things as they are in themselves, apart from all human sensibility and understanding. He wants to separate the realm of possible experience, the world as it presents itself to us, from the realm of things in themselves, noumena, which remain forever beyond the grasp of theoretical knowledge. And he wants to show that this very boundary is not a defeat for reason, but a discipline that refines the dignity and scope of human inquiry by directing our attention to the right use of our powers. To appreciate Kant's program, we begin with a distinction that he treats as almost operational for philosophy, the distinction between appearances and things in themselves. Our everyday experience, and indeed the entire edifice of natural science, describes the world as it appears to us. The colors we see, the shapes we measure, the causal chains we trace, the mathematical laws we derive, all of this concerns phenomena. The world is structured by the forms of our sensibility and the categories of our understanding. Kant insists that space and time are not empirical features that things carry in themselves. They are the very forms through which we organize all of our sensory input. In that sense, space and time are not properties of things so much as the manner in which things are presented to us. The world we know through science is a world of appearances, a phenomenal world shaped by the human mind's own faculties. And yet there is a realm beyond, the noumenal world, the things in themselves. Kant's famous move is not to deny the existence of a reality beyond our experience, but to insist that we cannot cognize that reality through pure theoretical reason. He writes in effect that the mind cannot pass beyond the boundary of possible experience and yield knowledge of things in themselves. The noumenal object is not something we can experience or conceive under the usual conditions of space, time, and causality. It resists the very categories through which we think, and so Kant makes a bold, even paradoxical claim. There is real, determinate matter beyond experience, but we cannot know it as such. We can speak meaningfully about how appearances must be arranged for experience to be possible, but we cannot leak through the veil and see the thing itself. This is where the transcendental dialectic, the core of Kant's critical project, enters. If appearances are structured by the mind, then pure reason, when it tries to extend its reach beyond possible experience, tends to generate illusions. Reason, left to its own devices, imagines that it can determine what lies beyond the bounds of possible experience, as if it were a matter of pure logic unfolding in the noumenal realm. In other words, reason plays tricks on itself when it tries to extrapolate into totalities that empirical data alone cannot fully warrant. These illusions produce what Kant calls antinomies, mutually compelling arguments for opposite conclusions, each supported by the same rational principles when applied without regard to the limits of experience. Let us dwell with two concrete antinomies that Kant elaborates, for they illuminate the structure of his critique and the heart of his diagnosis. The first antinomy concerns space and time and the finitude or infinitude of the universe. On the one hand, the thesis proclaims that the world has a beginning in time and is finite in spatial extent. On the other hand, the antithesis asserts that the world has no beginning in time and is infinite in space or time. If we attempt to reason strictly from the idea of absolute totality, the totality of all space and all time, without anchoring that reasoning in the possible experience of objects, we can conceive of a cosmos that had a temporal starting point, a past that begins, and a spatial boundary to surround it. Yet we can also conceive of a cosmos without a beginning, extending indefinitely in time, or with no spatial boundary at all. The same repertoire of concepts, causality, succession, unity, totality, produces both a thesis and its contrary, each appearing to carry the weight of necessary justification. The antinomy arises not because one side is true and the other false, but because we have asked pure reason to solve a problem that cannot be solved within the limits of possible experience. In other words, the conflict arises because we try to apply the forms of intuition to a totality that cannot be given to us in intuition at all. A second antinomy concerns causality and freedom, the possibility of free actions within a world that, on the surface, appears to be governed entirely by causal laws. The thesis asserts that there exists in the world a being of highest causality, namely freedom, such that it can be the ultimate source of moral actions. If there is freedom, then there must be a causal agent that is not bound by empirical conditions, not merely following natural laws but providing the ground of those laws for itself. The antithesis, by contrast, holds that every event in the world is determined by the natural, causal order. If everything is causally determined, then there is no room for freedom as ordinarily understood, and moral responsibility would become unintelligible. Once again, Kant shows that both sides feel compellingly rational because they inherit the same logical apparatus, yet apply it to questions that hurl us beyond, into domains that cannot be guaranteed by experience alone. Kant's creative solution to these antinomies is to recognize the source of the problem. Reason uses, in these cases, concepts in a way that assumes their applicability to objects as they are in themselves, rather than to appearances. The anticlimax is not to abolish the questions, but to reframe them. The conflict reveals the limits of pure speculative reason, not a deficiency in reality itself. The universe does not yield its secrets to our bare hunger for total explanation. Instead, the limits of what we can claim to know become the conditions under which science and philosophy can proceed fruitfully. Kant proposes that the antinomies illustrate the proper boundary between the theoretical and the practical, between what we can know about the world and what we must presuppose to guide our inquiry. If this is the heart of Kant's diagnosis, what then is the right use of reason? Kant's answer introduces a shift in how we conduct inquiry. He distinguishes between the theoretical use of reason, which aims and must aim to know the nature of things as they are, and the practical use of reason, which governs action and normative life. The theoretical use is subject to strict limits. It can tell us how appearances are arranged, the conditions under which experience is possible, and the structure of our sensibility and understanding. But when reason seeks to go beyond those limits in order to claim knowledge of noumena, it slides into the dialectical errors that produce antinomies. The practical use of reason, by contrast, is not a quest for empirical knowledge of things in themselves. It is a framework for evaluating actions, duties, and aims within the realm of experience. It is here, in the practical sphere, that Kant will later articulate his postulates of pure practical reason. That freedom is a necessary condition of moral responsibility, that immortality secures the coherence of moral law in a finite life, and that God underwrites the unity of moral order. These postulates, Kant emphasizes, do not claim theoretical knowledge of God, freedom, or immortality. They are rational commitments essential for moral life. They are bridges, not proofs, to be navigated with the regulative use of reason. What does science look like under this framework? Kant's insistence that appearances are structured by a priori forms of sensibility and principle of unity means that science does not simply mirror an objective, mind-independent world. It reveals how the mind organizes experience to make sense of it. In that sense, science is reliably descriptive of appearances because those appearances conform to the necessary conditions of human sensibility and understanding. Space and time, causality, categories of the understanding, these are not empirical discoveries we happen to make about the world. They are the conditions under which experience can be possible in the first place. The mind brings to the world a framework so potent that it makes empirical science not merely possible, but intelligible. Yet this is also why science leaves the noumenal untouched. The things that are in themselves, the noumena, remain beyond the reach of theoretical knowledge precisely because they are not within the domain that the mind's forms can access. They may exist, but we cannot know them as they are. We can only think about them through the regulative use of ideas grounded in our own cognitive architecture. Let us dwell a moment on what Kant does with the notion of the regulative use of reason. This is crucial for the ethical turn Kant will take, and it is essential for understanding how his system can be read in practice. The regulative use of reason refers to applying ideas, such as the unity of the world in a complete system, the concept of cause in nature, or the idea of the totality of conditions for a phenomenon, as heuristics to guide inquiry. These ideas function like navigational beacons. They help scientists unify disparate observations. They help us set the terms of inquiry, they inspire hypotheses, and they organize the pursuit of knowledge. But they do not, in Kant's strict sense, prescribe what the world must be in itself. They regulate the way we search for explanations. They do not guarantee that our explanations will reveal the noumenal reality. Consider the cosmological problem of the origin of the universe. The regulative use would urge cosmology to ask about the conditions under which a universe could come into being, to seek systematic unity in the laws governing cosmic evolution, and to construct frameworks that allow for coherent explanations across scales. It would not pretend to derive from reason alone a deduction of the thing in itself that caused the cosmos. That thing would remain beyond the reach of the theoretical order. Kant's move into ethics, often viewed as the bridge between the theory of knowledge and the moral philosophy that follows, rests on the idea that practical reason makes demands that cannot be satisfied by theoretical knowledge alone. The postulates of practical reason, God, freedom, immortality, are introduced to account for the coherent unity of moral law with the freedom required by moral responsibility. If we are to act as agents who are truly autonomous, capable of choosing the good and bearing the weight of our choices, then it makes sense to suppose that we exist as free beings and that there is a framework, an ultimate horizon, where moral order is grounded. We can hold these postulates without claiming that we have theoretical knowledge of them. They are, for Kant, the rational commitments that make moral life meaningful. In this sense, Kant's critical philosophy does not cancel the possibility of metaphysical talk, but it relocates metaphysical talk to a domain where it can be intelligible as regulative, aspirational, and moral, rather than as a claim to cognitive certainty about the structure of reality itself. As we walk through Kant's landscape, it is helpful to bring in historical context and the conversations he is responding to. The Enlightenment, with its confidence in reason to uncover the structure of reality, had produced a robust rational theology long tied to the idea that God's existence, the soul's immortality, and the nature of freedom might be demonstrated from the power of reason itself. In late 18th century Europe, many thinkers believed metaphysics could reach a secure foothold beyond experience. The older scholastic and mathematical ontologies, the rationalist programs of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and the systematic theologies that sought to deduce the nature of God and ultimate ends from a priori principles, all collided in a bustling marketplace of ideas. Kant looks outward and sees a crisscross of claims: metaphysical systems that claim to know the ultimate structure of reality, the hunger for a final, rational demonstration of God's existence, the assumption that freedom can be proven by a deduction from universal reason. But he also looks inward and sees the limits of the human mind, the constraints of sensibility and understanding, and the way the mind's own architecture shapes every claim to know the totality of things. Two concrete historical anecdotes illuminate Kant's position, and they help us understand the mood in which the critique took shape. The first concerns Kant's engagement with the perceived failures of metaphysics in late 18th century Europe. It is sometimes told that Kant's critical project grew out of a reaction to a wave of metaphysical overreach, the sense that rational speculation, unchecked by careful consideration of the conditions of human experience, had led philosophers to say almost anything about the nature of reality. Kant did not simply reject metaphysics, he reframed it. He asked philosophers to examine how their own cognitive capacities, how sensibility, how the understanding, and how the categories shape the possibility of knowledge. He asked them to test whether their most ambitious claims could be anchored in the conditions under which experience is even possible. In a sense, Kant's critique emerged from a climate in which many believed that reason could deliver certainty about the things in themselves. He argued that reason, when properly disciplined, can deliver certainty about the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, about the structure of experience, and about the normative demands of action. But it cannot give us a metaphysical knowledge of the world as it is in itself. The critique was thus both a diagnosis and a project, a diagnosis of the illusions that beset speculative reason and a project to recast philosophy so that it retains the dignity and scope of rational inquiry while acknowledging its proper limits. The second anecdote concerns the debates about rational theology and the limits of knowledge in Enlightenment discourse. The philosopher's arena was crowded with arguments about whether God could be proved by reason, whether religious language could be meaningful without appeal to revelation, and whether moral life required a metaphysical backing beyond empirical signs. Kant did not condemn religion, he reoriented it. He insisted that reason is bound by the limits of possible experience in its theoretical work, but that practical reason can legitimately postulate God, freedom, and immortality as conditions for moral life. The rational theologians of the period, often tied to rational demonstrations of divine existence, or to the claim that the universe's design revealed a divine mind, found in Kant a radical reconfiguration. He did not offer a new proof for God's existence, but he offered a way to speak of God in a way that preserves moral seriousness without overstepping the cognitive boundaries of theoretical knowledge. In this sense, Kant's position would be criticized by some as hedging or as preserving metaphysical questions in a space where others believed metaphysical systems had a secure, demonstrable foothold. Yet for Kant, this hedging is not a retreat from metaphysics. It is a sharpening of its aims, a separation of the lawful questions that science can answer from the unanswerable questions that belong to the moral horizon. Cross-referencing Kant's project with predecessors and later thinkers helps illuminate its texture. Aristotle's teleology and a robust theory of categories echo in Kant's insistence that the mind imposes a form of order on experience. The Aristotelian program aimed to explain why things are the way they are by appealing to ends and purposes in nature. Kant's program sought to explain how we come to know what we know by appealing to the forms of intuition and the categories our minds apply to experience. Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz present rival legacies of rational foundations. Descartes offers the certainty of clear and distinct ideas and the possibility of knowledge by rational deduction. Kant will not deny the power of rational insight, but he will insist that deduction cannot leap beyond the conditions under which objects can be given to us in sensible intuition. Spinoza's monism and the metaphysical system that makes God or nature the same substance pose a challenge to the Kantian separation of appearances from things in themselves. Kant responds by insisting that the ultimate unity and reality of things cannot be captured through the same ranges of human intuition that organize our experience. Leibniz, with his monads and his claim of a pre-established harmony, provides another foil. Kant will borrow the sense that the world has an intelligible order and a rational structure, yet he will refuse to collapse that order into the pure abundance of a single metaphysical system. In Kant's hands, the categories, the 10 fundamental ways in which mind structures experience, become the guarantee that science remains coherent, even as they reveal the limits of speculative ambition. And what of contemporary debates in epistemology and metaphysics? Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena still resonates in discussions about realism and anti-realism, about the extent to which science reveals an objective world independent of observers, and about the role of the observer in shaping what counts as evidence. The idea of a regulative principle, a guiding ideal that helps science progress without granting it the power to reveal noumenal reality, has found echoes in contemporary discussions of scientific realism, where theorists insist that science aims for truth about the unobservable aspects of nature, but must do so with an appreciation for the limits that observation imposes. Similarly, Kant's insistence on the practical postulates, freedom, immortality, God, as conditions for moral life rather than theoretical knowledge has a clear legacy in contemporary ethical theory, where some philosophers defend the idea that moral commitments require a certain metaphysical horizon, even if science cannot supply epistemic proof of those metaphysical claims. The dialogue with Kant today continues in debates about the status of a priori knowledge, the nature of explanation, and the limits of what science can tell us about the ultimate structure of reality. The questions that Kant opened: how do we distinguish the limits of reason from its potential reach? How do we ground our moral life when knowledge of the world's ultimate nature remains opaque? These questions persist, though the vocabulary may shift in light of new theories. Let us also consider how Kant's ideas might be illustrated with everyday examples and more concrete images. Think of the universe as a vast library whose shelves are arranged by the reader's own cognitive architecture. The library is real, the books are real, the system by which the shelves are organized, space, time, causality, are the reader's own filters. These filters do not create the books out of nothing, nor do they cause the library to exist. They simply determine what counts as a coherent, meaningful arrangement of the information the senses receive. When scientists uncover laws of motion or the structure of galaxies, they are not peering into the noumenal realm. They are discovering the regularities of appearance, the patterns that emerge once the human mind imposes its own structure on the flux of experience. The regulative ideas, such as the unity of the world in causal order or the idea of a total system of nature, act as a guiding compass. They help scientists and philosophers think across domains, seek unifying explanations, and imagine larger frameworks that can accommodate diverse data. But they do not grant us, in the theoretical sense, a window onto the thing in itself. Now let us turn more deliberately to the central practical turn of Kant's project, the bridge from theory to ethics through the postulates of practical reason. The postulates are not empirical discoveries. They are rational commitments essential to the moral life. The first postulate, freedom, is the condition under which moral responsibility makes sense. If actions were only the result of causal chains, if we were determined by antecedent events, then praise and blame would lose their grip on the will. But if we act as free agents who can determine our ends and shape our character, then moral praise and blame retain their force, and duties acquire objective legitimacy. The second postulate, immortality, functions as a horizon within which the moral law can coherently demand a kind of final compensation or fulfillment of virtue beyond the limits of a single finite life. Immortality in Kant's system is not a theoretical claim about the actual duration of the soul, but a necessary hypothesis that makes moral obligation plausible in the long run and preserves the stern demand of duty when natural happiness and the contingencies of life seem at odds with the ideal of the good. The third postulate, God, is similarly not a theorem of theoretical reason, but a postulate that grounds the unity and harmony of moral law. If there is a moral order in the universe, and if freedom makes genuine moral agency possible, then there must be a rational order that can reconcile the will with the good, even if that order cannot be demonstrated by theoretical arguments alone. And so Kant invites a form of rational faith, not as a purported demonstration of metaphysical truths, but as a powerful practical assumption that sustains moral seriousness and social trust. In offering these postulates, Kant also makes room for counterarguments that continue to echo through philosophy. Consider two prominent critiques that have relentlessly tested Kant's framework. The first is associated with Hegel, who, in various writings, argued that Kant's system both does justice to the regulative function of reason and preserves metaphysical questions only in a restricted, temporary space. Hegel contends that Kant's noumenal realm remains a residue of unfinished metaphysics, the inert, prohibited region behind the curtain of appearances. For Hegel, reality moves toward a self-developing absolute spirit, and Kant's insistence on a strict separation between appearance and things in themselves is a limitation that prevents philosophy from grasping the full dynamism and unity of the real. In short, Hegel would say, Kant keeps metaphysical questions alive, but only in a laboratory sense, never fully integrated into a comprehensive account of reality. Kant's own aim, of course, is not to abolish metaphysics outright, but to secure a disciplined metaphysics in which the more speculative questions do not masquerade as knowledge of the ultimate constitution of things. The second counterargument comes from Arthur Schopenhauer, who is perhaps the sharpest critic of Kant's noumenal notion. Schopenhauer agrees that the world as we experience it is mediated by appearances and that things in themselves lie beyond the reach of theoretical knowledge. Yet he pushes Kant in a provocative direction by insisting that the thing in itself that grounds our experience is, in his crucial move, will, the blind, driving force behind all our perceptions and actions. For Schopenhauer, the nervous system and the entire structure of existence are underwritten not just by a set of abstract forms, but by a singular, underlying will. The noumenon, then, is not merely a passive unknown. It is a dynamic principle that explains why the world is organized as it is, and why human beings experience desire, suffering, and longing. Kant's framework in Schopenhauer's critique ends up treating the will as a kind of empirical phenomenon, or at least as reducible to the conditions of human experience in a way that makes the will itself the hidden kernel of reality. Schopenhauer's critique thus undermines Kant's claim that noumena, as such, are unknowable in a way that remains free of any direct ontological commitment. In Schopenhauer's hands, Kant's system becomes a gateway to a deeper, albeit darker, metaphysical interpretation of the world's underlying force. These debates, Hegel's relational critique, Schopenhauer's will-centered interpretation, are not mere footnotes. They push Kant to clarify and defend the boundaries his critical project asks us to respect. They also help us see why Kant remains so central for contemporary debates, not as a system with fixed coordinates, but as a living conversation about what reason can and cannot do, how to conduct inquiry in a disciplined way, and how to harmonize science, philosophy, and ethics in a world that challenges every claim to final and definitive knowledge. To illustrate Kant's concerns with still more texture, we can bring in a couple of historical anecdotes that illuminate the mood and the stakes. First, consider Kant's own historical moment. A Europe awakening to the cracks in metaphysical certainty. Kant, writing from Königsberg, is not merely doing abstract thinking in a vacuum. He is responding to a culture of speculation that has, in recent decades, promised knowledge that would settle the deepest questions about God, the soul, the cosmos, the freedom of the will, with a confidence that seems almost audacious. In the salons and academies of the time, metaphysical systems, sometimes elegant and sometimes extravagant, were being argued with gusto. The critique's promise is not to pull the rug out from under metaphysics entirely, but to insist that the orders of thought that metaphysical systems propose must be subject to the checks provided by the conditions of human experience. The historical anecdote is not simply about Kant. It is about a philosophical movement wrestling with its own illusions and seeking a disciplined path forward. The late 18th century is a workshop for the mind, and Kant is the conscientious master craftsman who insists that the tools must be used in the right way, at the right depth, and for the right purposes. A second anecdote centers on debates about rational theology in Enlightenment discourse. Philosophers were asking whether religious language could be reconciled with reason, whether rational demonstrations of God's existence were a legitimate enterprise, and how to speak about the divine without falling into dogma. Kant's approach can appear as a cautious, almost cautious reformulation. He does not claim to prove God's existence on the basis of pure reason, but to show that the moral law within us, the need for freedom, and the unity of the practical order imply conditions that are best articulated if we suppose the existence of God as a postulate for moral life. The debates themselves reveal the climate in which Kant wrote, a culture eager to secure a rational basis for religious and moral life, but wary of the pretensions that metaphysical systems often relied upon to claim the final truth. Kant's recovery of a science that remains anchored in the appearances and of a moral life that requires postulates that point beyond the limits of theoretical knowledge presents a way to hold together the best impulses of the Enlightenment, to trust reason in its proper domain, and to recognize the necessity of moral horizons that reason alone cannot fully prove but must responsibly posit. Cross-referencing with Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz helps to situate Kant in a long conversation about how to ground knowledge and how to ground life. Aristotle's teleology and his analysis of categories prompt Kant to ask what kinds of ordering conditions are necessary for experience. Descartes' confidence in the power of reason presses Kant to show that reason can be secure only if it operates within the boundaries of possible experience. Spinoza's monistic system challenges Kant to preserve genuine pluralism and the moral dimension of human life in a universe that might be read as an absolute, necessary whole. Leibniz's idea of the world as the best of all possible worlds, and the pre-established harmony he posits between mind and world, invites Kant to examine how far rationalist hypotheses can deliver genuine explanations of the linkage between mind and matter without collapsing the gap into mere logical fiction. Contemporary debates in epistemology and metaphysics, about internalism versus externalism in justification, about the status of a priori knowledge, about the reality or ideality of the external world, and about the status of mathematical truths, show that Kant's core concerns persist. The central questions, how much can we know, how should we reason, how should we live, remain alive because Kant framed them with such care and with such insistence on the limits that knowledge must respect. If we think of the practical implications, Kant's philosophy provides tools for navigating real-world questions without slipping into the hubris of supposed certainty about the ultimate nature of things. In scientific inquiry, Kant's insistence on the priori conditions of possible experience reminds us that our theories are meaningful only insofar as they fit into a coherent structure of understanding that the mind actively imposes. It cautions against a naive objectivism that assumes the world will present itself in a single, unproblematic way to any rational agent. Yet it also affirms that science is incredibly successful at describing appearances and patterns that obey regular laws, and that this success should be understood as the fruit of the mind's own organizing resources rather than as a direct map of noumenal reality. In ethics, the postulates of practical reason provide a robust move beyond mere descriptive accounts of human behavior to a normative frame that makes moral responsibility intelligible, even when empirical science cannot confirm metaphysical claims. The moral law, the autonomy of the rational will, and the possibility of universalizable duties gain their seriousness precisely from the sense that there is a rational structure to moral life that transcends every finite circumstance. In the end, Kant does not offer us a final metaphysical architecture of the cosmos. He offers a thick, disciplined account of what we can know and how we ought to live with that knowledge. He asks us to recognize that a certain kind of wonder will always loom beyond the limits of experience, and that it is precisely this space that sustains the moral imagination. The critic in Kant, who wants to demonstrate the existence of God by a syllogism from causality to freedom to the divine nature, is reconfigured into the critic who shows that such demonstrations cannot stand in the theoretical sense. And yet the moral life, governed by the categorical imperative and the sense of duty, remains profound and intelligible, anchored by the idea of freedom and guided by the regulative principles that keep science honest and moral life meaningful. As we close this long reflection, we might look at the larger arc. Kant's project is not a retreat from metaphysical ambition, but a reorientation of it. He does not give us a room with a view into the noumenal garden. He gives us a map of the boundaries around the garden, a guide to how to approach the world with courage and humility, a way to pursue knowledge that respects the conditions under which we can know and still attend to what lies beyond those conditions. He invites us to experiment with the mind's own furniture, space, time, causality, unity, totality, under the discipline of critical examination, and to recognize that the most important forms of knowledge, the knowledge that science can reliably deliver, the knowledge that moral life requires, the knowledge that our shared human striving for reason and meaning demands, are sustained by a careful balance between what can be known and what must be held in the responsible domain of faith, longing, and ethical obligation. If you take away one thing from Kant's metaphysics, reason, and the limits of knowledge, noumena, antinomies, and the dialectic, I would phrase it as this. The boundary line is not a wall to imprison thought, but a lens that clarifies how thought should move. The phenomena reveal the skeleton of the natural order. The noumena remind us that reality, in all its richness, eludes the grasp of human cognition in its theoretical demand for absolute certainty. The dialectic shows us that our own mind can generate contradictions when it pushes beyond its rightful domain, and that the cure is not to abandon ambition, but to refine our method. To use reason to illuminate the structure of experience, to use imagination to ask the right questions, and to use moral law to ground our conduct when the cosmos refuses to yield a definitive answer about things in themselves. The regulative ideals of unity and system will always guide science toward more comprehensive, more elegant explanations, while the practical postulates will continue to shape our human life toward freedom, virtue, and hope. As we listen to Kant in the quiet hours after the lecture or the tutorial, we might repeat to ourselves with a gentle cadence the famous initial maxim that guides his enterprise. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. If we remember this, we will see that Kant's critique is not a negation of knowledge, but an invitation to a wiser, more disciplined form of inquiry, one that respects both the grandeur of human reason and the dignity of the mystery that remains beyond all possible experience. In that balance lies the enduring relevance of Kant for science, for ethics, and for the ongoing conversation about what it means to know, to value, and to be human in a universe that invites inquiry even as it withholds its deepest secrets. So when we ask again in the quiet, what can be known about noumena, how can the antinomies be resolved, and what makes a rational life possible in the wake of such limits, we are not merely revisiting an old debate. We are reminding ourselves that philosophy is a living enterprise. It is a patient, careful, often unsettling enterprise that asks us to mind our methods as much as our conclusions. Kant gives us a way to keep science honest, to keep ethics meaningful, and to keep faith in a horizon beyond the day's data, without pretending that horizon is a direct empirical object of knowledge. The dialogue with Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and the streams of contemporary epistemology and metaphysics continues, and with it, the question that has never stopped being the central question of philosophy. What can we know, what must we do, and how shall we live with both humility and audacity in the face of a world that is at once accessible to our reason and endlessly beyond its reach? What follows is an invitation into a quiet room where the question, what should I do, is not answered by clever tricks or the newest data set, but by a serious, unflinching look at the form of our own reason. It's a room Kant invites us into, a room where the furniture is made of insistence and consistency, where the walls repeat the same demand in every corner, that we act only according to maxims we could will to become universal laws. And as we step into that room, we discover that the moral life for Kant is not a collection of feelings that we happen to label virtuous or generous. It is a rational order we consciously legislate for ourselves, a law we give to ourselves as rational beings capable of autonomy. Autonomy for Kant is not a fancy word for freedom from rules, but the precise capacity by which a rational agent gives itself the law. The law is not imposed from outside. It originates from within the agent, whose rational nature demands that certain maxims be applied universally, without exception, even when doing so feels costly or inconvenient. To begin, imagine a person standing at the edge of a cliff with a friend in need of help. The moral question isn't simply what feels right in the moment or what maxim will maximize happiness in the short term. Kant asks you to examine the maxim behind your action. Are you acting in a way you could will to be a universal law? If you say, I will lie to others when it serves me, because lying appears to work in my particular case, you have declared a principle that, if universalized, would strip the very meaning from promises and communication. A lying promise is a promise made with the intention to be broken. But if everyone treated promises this way, the very practice of promising would collapse, no one could trust promises, and the concept of a promise would be incoherent. The maxim you would be endorsing is not merely a personal choice. It is a principle that, if universalized, defeats its own aim. That is the core of Kant's formula of universal law, the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Yet autonomy is not a solitary or atomized command. It is a law that one discovers to be binding because it is a law one tends to give to oneself as a rational agent. The reasoning behind it is not arbitrary. It is tied to the idea that rational beings are ends in themselves, not mere instruments for someone else's purpose. This leads us to the second formulation, the humanity formula. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Here the moral agent recognizes the intrinsic worth of rational beings. We are not instruments to be used, even if our usage would produce favorable outcomes. We are agents who possess an end in itself that commands respect. The moral law in this light binds us not to convenience or calculated success, but to a form of respect for rational agency. And Kant's third formulation, the kingdom of ends, invites us to widen the horizon of our action. It asks us to act as if our maxims were to become laws in a universal kingdom of ends, where every agent is both legislator and subject, where autonomy is coextensive with mutual recognition. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. And further, act as if you were always through your maxims a legislator in a universal kingdom of ends. These are not simply clever phrases. They are invitations to hold ourselves to the standard of universal rational legislation, to imagine social life not as a war of competing whims, but as a constitutional framework that respects every rational will. As we travel deeper into Kant's ethics, we encounter a central claim. The moral law is a law we bind ourselves to through rational agency. Yet the law is not a cold arithmetic of duties without texture. The standpoint of the good will, that is, the will that acts from the motive of duty, has a special dignity in Kant's eyes. He writes in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals that the good will good without limitation is the only thing that is good without qualification. The moral worth of an action arises not from its success nor from its consequences, but from the agent's motive. Does the agent act from respect for the moral law? The phrase is famous, a kind of liturgy of moral seriousness. Act from duty. Duty, for Kant, is the necessity of an action out of respect for the law. This is not a cold command, but the sense that reason, when properly exercised, births obligation that binds the agent beyond inclination and feeling. But if the law resides in us, how do we distinguish it from mere expediency, from preferences that we call virtue merely because they satisfy our tastes? Kant supplies us with a practical anthropology. Reason is restless, and the will is capable of choosing itself as the author of the law. This is autonomy in the strongest sense. The will is not a captive of desire or inherited custom, but is capable of legislating for itself, and in doing so, it binds itself to universalizable maxims. This is precisely why the moral law has a distinctive claim on us, because it arises from a rational structure within us, a universality that obligates in every case without exception. The moral law is categorical, not hypothetical. It does not tell us what will yield happiness if we do X, but what we ought to do regardless of whether happiness follows. From this, Kant draws three linked formulations that illuminate how a single principle can bear fruit across different moral situations. The first is the universal law formulation we discussed. Act only according to maxims that you could rationally will to become universal laws. The second is the humanity formulation. Treat rational beings as ends in themselves, never merely as means. The third is the kingdom of ends formulation. Act as if your maxims could in principle be a law within a system of rational legislators who all regard themselves as ends in themselves. Put differently, Kant is not satisfied with a mere rulebook of duties divorced from the people they govern. He wants a polity of rational agents, each recognizing the other's rational authority and dignity, each willing to be governed by a law that could be accepted by all as a law. To become a fully formed Kantian, one must also attend to the concrete structure of duties. Duties to oneself, duties to others, and in an often controversial move, duties to animals. These distinctions matter because they show how Kant's ethics is not a bare ledger of do's and don'ts, but a map of rational commitments that organize our lives. Duties to oneself include the duties to develop one's talents, to cultivate one's rational nature, to preserve one's own life, and to refrain from actions that would undermine one's own rational agency. Perfect duties to self include prohibitions such as suicide, self-deception, or allowing one's rational capacities to deteriorate. Imperfect duties to self may include the cultivation of talents, the broadening of one's capacities, and the pursuit of personal improvement and education. Duties to others flow from the second formulation, the humanity formulation. If we treat others as ends and never merely as means, we owe them not to lie to them, not to deceive them, not to use them as mere instruments to our own ends, and we owe them ways of supporting their rational agency. Here the duty to help others when one can do so without sacrificing one's own autonomy becomes a duty of benevolence in Kantian terms. It is not that every benevolent act is morally required in every moment. Rather, we have imperfect duties of beneficence that invite us to contribute to others' welfare when feasible. The moral law binds us in such a way that when we act benevolently, we do so because it is a rational obligation to promote the ends of rational beings, not because we feel irresistibly moved by sympathy or emotion. But what about animals? Kant is famously studied for his view that we have no direct duties to animals. That is, there is no obligation to treat a dog or a horse with moral law's exacting standard unless that treatment has consequences for our duties to rational beings. Yet this is not a license to cruelly use animals. Rather, Kant argued that cruelty to animals would harm one's own rational nature and thereby injure one's moral capacities in relation to other rational beings. In other words, we have indirect duties to animals. By how we treat animals, we cultivate or degrade our own humanity, which in turn affects how we treat other rational beings. So there's a line from how we treat animals to how we treat people, and that line reveals a deeper structure of moral psychology and social virtue. The duty to refrain from cruelty, to respect life, to avoid causing needless pain, even to animals, is connected to disciplines of character that shape our moral sensibility and our responsiveness to others. The relation between moral law and inclination is one of critical importance in Kant's system. Our inclinations are often powerful. They pull us toward happiness, comfort, preference, and personal advantage. Yet the moral law asks us to act in a way that might oppose or override those inclinations. The moral worth of the will is not in successfully satisfying these tendencies, but in pursuing the law for its own sake, because it is the law. In this sense, Kant's ethics is a call to a form of rational integrity, to align one's actions with a principle that one could will to be universal. This does not mean that happiness is irrelevant. It means that happiness, while important as a natural end, must bow to the authority of the moral law. The happiness that follows from acting in accord with the moral law is not the ground of the duty. Rather, it is an agreeable accompaniment that confirms the rational soundness of the act. The moral law commands in a way that can be endured even when its demands are costly, and in some cases, even when happiness appears to be sacrificed. The groundwork and the critique of practical reason push us to distinguish among several layers of rational life. On the one hand, we have the practical reason that legislates moral law. On the other, the postulates of pure practical reason, freedom, immortality, and God that make sense of moral responsibility beyond the finite life. These postulates are not demonstrated conclusions, but presuppositions that make sense of our moral experience. Freedom is the precondition of moral responsibility. Without freedom, there would be no moral law that could bind us. Immortality is the horizon that makes possible the idea that the moral law could be fully realized beyond the limited human lifetime. God, for Kant, is a postulate that grounds the idea of a rational order in which moral progress has a place, even if that order is not empirically given to us. The religion within the bounds of reason makes this explicit. Religion, for Kant, is not the outward display of ritual or dogma. It is a moral project, the cultivation of rational devotion to the good, the faith that the rational order of the universe aligns with our moral duties. The line is crisp. Religion, for Kant, is not theology that explains the world, but a discipline of moral life that seeks alignment with the moral law and the rational order of the cosmos. If we turn toward real-world applications, Kant's ethics speaks to two classic cases that have dominated discussions for centuries: the lying promise and the keeping of promises as a matter of moral law. The lying promise case is the quintessential test of universalizability. A person might need to lie to secure a favorable outcome, perhaps to avoid harm or to protect themselves from exposure. But Kant's response is not about the severity of the lie in that moment. It is about the principle in which the lie is rooted. The maxim, when I need something, I will lie to secure my aim, cannot be willed as a universal law. If everyone lied whenever it suited them, promises would be worthless, trust would dissolve. The very concept of promising would collapse into a ritual with no cognitive content. And if someone were to ask whether a lying promise could ever be morally justified, Kant would likely respond that a rational agent cannot coherently will that the practice of lying should stand as a universal law, because it would neutralize the very purpose of promising. The moral law prohibits the maxim because it is not universalizable. It is not a law that rational beings could will, because it would destroy the rational agency of all participants in communication. A parallel case concerns keeping promises and honoring commitments. Kant's argument here is not a function of happiness or the pragmatic benefit of a promise's fulfillment. It rests on the dignity of the agent who has given a promise as a rational commitment. When you promise, you consciously legislate a personal rule that you intend to fulfill. The moral law requires you to fulfill it because to fail would imply that you treated your word as a mere instrument of your momentary aims. You may face temptations to break a promise when keeping it seems to impose heavy costs or when your circumstances change. Yet the good will, if it is to deserve the name, acts out of duty to the moral law by choosing to fulfill promises even when it would be easier not to. This is not blind stubbornness. It is the rational choice to respect the person who trusts your word and to maintain the reliability of social bonds that hinge on the trustworthiness of promises. In Kant's vocabulary, benevolence and charity also find their rightful place as duties, but in a nuanced way. The duty to benevolence is not a mere outward sentiment or spontaneous generosity that flares when convenient. It is a rational obligation to aid others when one can do so without compromising one's own autonomy or the moral law. The Kantian frame can accommodate acts of charity as imperfect duties. You ought to contribute to the welfare of others to some degree, but the exact amount and manner are not dictated by the moral law. The command is to promote the good in a way that respects the autonomy of all rational beings, including those receiving aid, and to avoid any form of coercion or manipulation. Charity, in a Kantian sense, is good insofar as it respects the dignity of those whom we aid and does not treat them as mere means to an end, but as ends in themselves in a community of rational agents. The moral theory, then, can be applied to modern contexts. In the workplace, for instance, the requirement to honor contracts and to give truthful information to clients or customers is not simply a matter of policy. It is a direct instantiation of the humanity formula. If you lie to a client to secure a sale, you not only mislead the person, but you degrade your own rational agency by acting on a maxim that you would not be willing to universalize. In political life, the formulation is a clarion call for institutions that respect the autonomy and dignity of individuals. The republic, or the notion of a polity that treats citizens as ends in themselves, becomes plausible in Kant's framework when the institutions reflect the principle that laws are enacted through rational deliberation and through a social contract that all parties could reasonably accept. As Kant's theory is read and reinterpreted over time, it has become a touchstone for modern understandings of autonomy and human rights, though not without tension. The way Rawls built on Kant, and in some ways transformed Kantian rationality into a theory of justice that can withstand pluralism, is a crucial cross-reference. Rawls's two principles of justice, especially the first principle guaranteeing equal basic liberties, have a strong Kantian resonance. The idea that each person must have an equal claim to basic liberties reflects a Kantian intuition about the equal moral worth of rational beings. Rawls's method, reflecting a rational fair procedure behind the veil of ignorance, can be read as an extension of the Kantian project. It seeks to secure a political arrangement that respects the humanity of all by designing institutions that no one would rationally reject as an end in itself. But Kant's framework is not merely a prelude to Rawls. It is also in dialogue with Mill and Aristotle. Mill's utilitarianism pushes us to consider outcomes and the maximization of happiness as a criterion of value. Kant would retort that happiness alone cannot be the ground of moral obligation because happiness is contingent and varies from person to person. A rule could maximize happiness in one scenario but demand the destruction of the moral law in another. Aristotle's virtue ethics, by contrast, centers on flourishing, character, and the cultivation of the good life that embodies the rational life lived well within a community. Kant's system might appear formal and rigorous in contrast to Aristotle's more teleological approach, yet one can read Kant as providing a rigorous method to ensure that virtue is not simply a matter of habit or feeling, but of rational commitment to universalizable standards. Spinoza offers another kind of foil. Spinoza's rational order, where freedom is knowing necessity, invites a different conception of human agency. Kant's response, in part, is to insist that freedom is the practical postulate that makes moral law possible. The will must be free in a rational sense to legislate laws for itself. The tension between determinism and freedom surfaces in debates about moral responsibility. If the world is determined by causal laws, can we still hold rational agents morally accountable? Kant's answer is that we must treat rational agents as free in the sense that they can will laws for the sake of universal rationality, even if that freedom is constrained within the larger causal order. Turning to religion, Kant's religion within the bounds of reason is a crucial companion to his moral theory. There he develops the provocative idea that religion is a moral project, a form of practical rationality oriented toward virtue and the cultivation of moral character. He suggests that religious faith can be compatible with rational moral life if kept within the bounds of reason, and he insists that moral duties do not require religious belief to be binding. Yet the postulates of practical reason, freedom, immortality, and God provide a scaffolding that makes sense of moral responsibility when we reflect on why moral effort matters beyond this life, and how the moral order might be grounded in a rationally justifiable belief in a divine order. The famous way to put it is that God, freedom, and immortality are postulates of pure practical reason. In Religion Within the Bounds of Reason, Kant writes about the moral project of religion. Not the ritualistic outward show or the dogmatic assertions of belief, but the inward alignment of life with moral law, the cultivation of faith as fidelity to the moral law, and the sense that the moral order carries with it a kind of religious salience in the form of moral seriousness and conscientious duty. An important element in Kant's thought is his vision of cosmopolitan right and perpetual peace. The perpetual peace, a philosophical sketch, is a compact and intentionally practical piece in which Kant offers a blueprint for a world order that could, in principle, bring an end to perpetual war. He proposes 3 definitive articles of perpetual peace. First, that no secret treaties be entered into. Second, that a federation of free states be established to guarantee peace among nations. And third, that republican constitutions be adopted by states. The third article is especially important because a republican constitution, in Kant's sense, means a political structure in which the executive power is not united with the sovereign will of the state, and where the people have the right to participate, via representation or other forms of political accountability, in shaping laws. The first article is a call for a public peace that treats other states as partners rather than enemies, to be achieved through transparency, and the end of conspiratorial diplomacy. The second article envisions a federation, a voluntary union of free states bound by shared norms of justice rather than by coercive force. The third article brings cosmopolitan rights into political reckonings. Individuals are entitled to certain minimal rights of hospitality and asylum that transcend the borders of any single state and reflect a universal respect for rational beings as such. In this landscape, the cosmopolitan vision is not a utopian fantasy, but a rationally grounded program for institutional design. Kant's perpetual peace is as much a laboratory for political theory as it is a politico-philosophical manifesto. He imagines a federation of states where even the law of nations would be constrained by a higher law of universal hospitality and mutual recognition of citizens' rights. The idea of a federation, rather than a world government that wields coercive power, emphasizes a system in which states maintain their autonomy yet participate in a shared legal order that reduces incentives for war. The cosmopolitan right, hospitality, asylum, and a universal moral duty to aid those in need extends moral consideration to individuals regardless of nationality or local allegiance. This is a Kantian seed that, in the hands of liberal political theory, grows into debates about humanitarian intervention, refugee policy, and the responsibilities of global governance. Two historical anecdotes illuminate the way Kant's thought traveled from a quiet university town to the louder rooms of political debate. The first is Kant's exposure to the political upheavals of the late 18th century and his enduring influence on liberal political thought. Kant lived in Königsberg, a city that was relatively insulated from the front lines of war, yet he was no stranger to the tremors of a Europe convulsed by revolution, war, and the reorganization of states. He witnessed the effects of political transformation on the idea of law and legitimacy, and the basic structure of his political philosophy, liberty under the rule of law, civil rights, and republican government, tossed or fertilized by this exposure. He never joined a revolutionary movement. Instead, he pressed his readers to imagine a rational constitutional order grounded in autonomy and the moral law. In a sense, Kant's philosophy offered a sober, principled response to the upheavals of the age. A framework that could sustain liberal political thought without surrendering to the passions of upheaval or the temptations of force. The second anecdote centers on the Perpetual Peace essay itself as a laboratory for cosmopolitanism. In 1795, Kant published this compact treatise in the middle of a Europe still rent by war, in which he proposed a federation of free states and the republican constitution as the seedbed for lasting peace. The work is a rare instance of philosophical theory aspiring to sculpt concrete political arrangements. Kant's federation envisages a system in which states retain sovereignty but consent to a common legal order that restricts war as an instrument of policy. The cosmopolitan rights Kant articulates, rights that flow from the dignity of rational beings, lay the groundwork for modern debates about human rights beyond borders, asylum policies, and the moral legitimacy of international law. The Perpetual Peace Project is not a naive dream, but a disciplined attempt to translate the moral law into the architectural design of a world governed by law rather than by power. When Kant writes that no peace shall be concluded in the world that is based on anything other than a federation of free states, he is not simply predicting a political future. He is prescribing a method for building a durable peace by aligning political institutions with the rational ends of universal moral law. These historical anchor points converge with a broader conversation in modern philosophy. Kant's ideas have been cross-referenced and reinterpreted by later theorists across a spectrum of positions. Rawls's theory of justice, with its emphasis on liberty and equality, can be seen as a modern appropriation of Kantian core commitments, reframed through a veil of ignorance as a procedural device to derive principles that rational agents would accept. The emphasis on rational agency and the equal moral worth of persons resonates with Rawls's first principle of justice, which safeguards basic liberties for all. Mill's utilitarian framework, by contrast, puts emphasis on the end of happiness and the consequences of actions. Kant would challenge Mill to show how contentedness or greater happiness could justify violations of the dignity of rational beings or the universalizability of maxims. The challenge then becomes one of reconciliation. Can a society that prizes the moral law and cosmopolitan rights find a place for utilitarian considerations in a way that respects rational autonomy? Aristotle offers yet another point of reference. If Kant's moral law is the self-imposed necessity that binds rational agents to universalizable maxims, Aristotle's ethics centers on the cultivation of virtue and the flourishing of the virtuous life, eudaimonia. Aristotle would ask whether a life widely and consistently governed by the categorical imperative necessarily yields human flourishing. Kant would reply that flourishing without respect for the moral law is only partial, perhaps even illusory. The good life in Aristotle's sense requires habituation and character, but Kant insists that habituation must be guided by reason and moral law rather than by custom or taste. Spinoza, for his part, would emphasize the rational order of the universe and the way freedom is conceived as understanding necessity. Kant's response is to locate freedom in the practical capacity to legislate for oneself, to act in accord with universal rational law, even within the determinism of nature. The dialogue with Spinoza thus becomes a conversation about what counts as genuine freedom and what counts as rational obligation in a determined world. In light of these cross-references, we can see how contemporary debates in political philosophy have extended Kant's moral architecture into new terrains. One major line of thought concerns the place of autonomy and moral status in democratic theory and public policy. How should institutions respect the autonomy of diverse individuals while maintaining social cohesion and public welfare? How do we think about duties to refugees or to vulnerable populations in a globalized world? Kant's insistence on respecting individuals as ends in themselves, and his call for universal moral principles, provides a robust logic for arguing in favor of universal human rights, non-discrimination, and policies that treat every person with equal moral concern. Yet the tension between universal duties and local sovereignty remains a lively site of debate. Kant's cosmopolitan vision helps us imagine a framework for international public policy that goes beyond mere expediency and considers moral legitimacy as the ultimate ground for action. The concept of religion as moral project also remains vital in contemporary debates. Religion within the bounds of reason argues that religious faith can be compatible with rational moral life if kept within the bounds of reason. In late modern debates about secularism, pluralism, and the moral authority of religious and non-religious worldviews, Kant's insistence on the moral rational basis for ethical life offers a common ground. If religion is recast as a discipline of moral formation, a teacher of responsibility to the poor, the vulnerable, the stranger, and the foreigner, then it can be a constructive influence within public life rather than a source of sectarian conflict. The challenge remains to translate Kant's insights into a pluralistic political community where diverse moral vocabularies and religious commitments coexist under a shared, rationally accessible moral law. As we move toward a synthesis, it is important to emphasize the core: autonomy understood as self-legislation, respect for rational agency, and the dignity of persons. This is not a rigid doctrine of obedience to a hollow rule. Rather, it is a call to recognize the seriousness of moral life as an enterprise of reason that demands a steadfast commitment to universalizable principles. The categorical imperative is not a mere checklist. It is a method of moral reflection that asks us to test the maxims behind our actions, to consider whether we could will them to be universal laws, to think of the humanity in every person as a perpetual injunction to respect and dignify, and to imagine a social order in which every individual's rational agency is recognized as a source of universal law within a system of ends. In closing, let us reflect on how this philosophy appears in practice, in how we choose to tell the truth or to keep a promise, in how we treat animals and how we treat workers and neighbors, in how we conceive of charity and benevolence, and in how we imagine public institutions and international order. Kant's ethics asks us to place the moral law above personal preference and to demand from ourselves the courage to act out of respect for reason and for the dignity of every rational being. It is a call to a disciplined freedom. Freedom not to pursue whatever we desire at will, but to consent to a law that we have a fundamental right to impose upon ourselves, because it is a law that one could rationally endorse universally. Autonomy is thus both a gift and a burden, a testament to rational agency and a rigorous test of character. The moral life, in this sense, is a continuous practice of affirming the worth of rational beings and of choosing to act in ways that could be willed as universal. It is a lifelong dialogue between the particular claims of our desires and the universal demands of reason, a dialogue that Kant believes can guide not only private choices but the political life of nations, the design of institutions, and the path toward a more just and peaceful world. Now consider the historical arc that leads from these questions to action. The late 18th century, with its upheavals and debates about liberty, sovereignty, and the rights of individuals, offered Kant a testing ground for these ideas. He did not seek to bandwagon with those who proclaimed an immediate universal emancipation. Instead, he sought a more patient, more principled path, a form of political liberalism grounded in autonomy and law, a moral anthropology that could speak across cultural divides, a theory that could anchor global politics in universal rights rather than episodic power. When we study Kant's influence on liberal political thought, we are following a trail that begins with the bedrock claim of rational autonomy and ends in the modern possibilities for constitutional governance, international law, and human rights. The Perpetual Peace essay, in particular, offers a clear example of how a philosopher can propose a plan for international harmony that remains deeply loyal to the moral law. A federation of free states, republican constitutions, and cosmopolitan rights that extend beyond the borders of any single state. It is a plan to turn the moral law into the structure of political life, to make a world where the dignity of rational agents is recognized not only in private life, but in the architecture of nations. And so we return to the core questions. What is it to be autonomous? What does it mean to legislate for oneself in a way that respects the autonomy of others? What does it mean to treat humanity as an end, and what is the moral significance of the kingdom of ends? Kant's answers are not merely academic. They challenge us to test our commitments, to examine the underlying maxims of our actions, and to imagine a social order in which reason and humanity are bound together in a single, intelligible law. They invite us to reflect on duties to self, to others, and to animals as part of an integrated moral life, to recognize that duties to benevolence and charity are not optional extras but integral aspects of rational duty when we consider the good of others and the cultivation of virtuous character. They challenge us to face the critiques of rigidity and formalism with careful responses that recognize the strength of universalizability while acknowledging the complexities of moral life. And they invite us to see in Kant's project a living tradition, a conversation with Rawls, Mill, Aristotle, and Spinoza, a conversation that reaches into religious reflection, into political institutions, and into the everyday choices that shape our lives. If we listen closely, we hear a promise that a rational science of moral life is possible, that a principled, universal order can be imagined and defended, and that a political philosophy grounded in the dignity of rational agents can inform real-world decisions, from the boardroom to the parliament to the international arena. It is not a guarantee of easy answers or instant solutions. It is rather an invitation to a disciplined, reflective life in which we ask with honesty and humility, what maxims do I endorse? Could I will them to be universal? Do I treat others as ends in themselves? Can I imagine a social order where the law I obey is binding on all rational beings? And in seeking to answer these questions, we follow in the footsteps of a thinker who believed that the moral life, though demanding, is the highest expression of human rationality, and that the dignity of rational agency is a beacon that can light the way toward a more just, more peaceful, and more humane world. What remains crucial is to keep returning to the practice of testing maxims. When a temptation arrives to bend the truth, to break a promise for convenience, to use another as a mere means, or to ignore the welfare of others because it feels costly to help, we must pause and ask, could I rationally will that this maxim become a universal law? Would I be comfortable living in a world where everyone acted this way? In this simple but demanding test, we find the structure of a life governed not by isolated impulses, but by the disciplined, autonomous choice to honor the moral law. And when we do so, we contribute not only to our own moral development, but to a civilization that respects the dignity and rational agency of all persons, that favors the rule of law over the law of the jungle, and that maintains a hopeful vision of a peaceful, cosmopolitan order in which the achievements of reason and the fidelity to moral law are the true sources of legitimacy and progress.